appeared in 2009 after 4 decades of research. He is currently writing with Sarah Waltz a biography of William Herschel's musical and early astronomical years. In 2012, he received the Leroy Doggett Prize of the AAS Historical Astronomy Division for his career contributions to the history of astronomy. And as many of you know, Woody has a passion for sundials.
Thank you, Steve. Steve is a speaker later on in the session. Here's a basic timeline of William Herschel. Born in 1738 in Hanover, Germany. At age 42, when he's been doing astronomy for a few years, he discovers the planet Uranus, which is what made him a rock star. The only planet discovered since caveman Og, meaning that discovered with a telescope. And then he died at age 83, a good age for that time. And so this discovery of Uranus kind of splits his life in two, and it also splits his life in two in that he was a musician almost entirely up till age 42. And that is leading to a book that I and Sarah Waltz, the second speaker, are now writing with the tentative title of William Herschel, The Music and Early Astronomy Years. No one has looked much at these years. And here you see some of the main events in his life. Whoops, why is this changing automatically? Here you see some of the main events in his life. Moving around in London and Yorkshire and to Bath. His sister Carolyn joined him. She became a lifetime partner in his astronomy. He bought his first telescope at age 34. But then still was mainly a musician for the next 9 years. He moved to Windsor and became the king's astronomer near Windsor Castle at age 43, got a lifetime pension from the king. His son John was born in 1792, and he became just simply one of the greatest astronomers ever. He put out 72 papers over his life in the most prestigious journal in the world in science of that time, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Tremendous output, and you'll see that he was a workaholic, right from being a boy even. So here's a map of northern Germany. Hanover province was an electorate, it was called, was a kind of similar to where Lower Saxony state is in modern Germany. You can see the city of Hamburg there, but he's nowhere near England, and he's born in the city of Hanover. And here is a map from the time he was born. You can see it's a fortress. It was a garrison city, and so it was full of soldiers. And in fact, his father was a bandsman that went out into the field with the soldiers, as well as entertaining people in the town. And his father raised the family to be bandsmen, meaning that all the boys were taught violin and oboe. And where you see in this family tree, where you see the eighth notes, that indicates that the person was a musician. So here's William in the center. And then to left and right are the siblings that survived to adulthood. Here's Carolyn Herschel over here, 11 years younger than he is. Here's William did not get married until late in life, but their one child is John Herschel, also extremely important in the history of astronomy. So it was a musical family. And in fact, all of these people emigrated to England, where opportunities were much greater as a musician in the amount of money you made and the gigs you could get and so forth. The scrap down below was kept by William throughout his life, and the scrap to the left. William says here, my solo written by my father, which he taught me to play on the violin, and then at the bottom, a relic. So this was the kind of thing, his father did not compose the music, but he had to write it out in hand for his son to use. So this is a world premiere of this view of William Herschel. No one's ever seen this before. And of course, he was Wilhelm when he was in Germany. Here he is as a teenager. The face is actually the youngest view we have of him when he was 25 years old. He was tall and lanky, and there he is with his oboe. And the uniform has been researched greatly by those people that like to recreate battles of the past. That this is what the bandsman wore in Hanover at that time. He was with the Foot Guards Regiment that was in town. They went out to meet the French army with about 60,000 soldiers versus only 35,000 that were on the French side. This is the 7 Years' War that happened for 7 years, as you might imagine, from 1756 to 1763. It was Britain versus France, as always, but Prussia was an ally to Britain, and Austria and Russia to France. It turned out that the battle was largely a draw in that both sides thought they were losing and retreated, the fog of battle. But the French overall were able to take over Hanover within a couple of months. And that's when William's father said to both William and his older brother, Jacob, that, look, this is too dangerous for you guys. You need to get out of here. And you see in the upper left here that I have WH in the baggage. So when the real battle began in Hastenbach, you get the cooks and the wagon masters and the musicians, out of the way, and so they're off on the side. But nevertheless, it was getting too dangerous over there, and bullets were whizzing through the trees and such. And so William's father said, "You guys get out of here. You're only in your late teens." Now he was a deserter. He covered this up throughout his life, but in essence, his father told him to desert, and it all got patched up eventually. But so he went to England, and he was in London for over 2 years, but we just have very, very little historical evidence of what he was doing. This is the first evidence of a concert that we know that he participated in. You see, it says a solo upon the tenor by Mr. Herschel. That's the viola that we'll be hearing later on. We don't know what piece it was, but he was writing at that time some viola concertos. And now a map of England to orient you. London down here in the south, but we're going to be going quickly to the north, where we have more evidence about what William was doing, where he spent 9 years in Yorkshire before he went back down to Bath, which we don't have time to get into his whole history in Bath, where he became a very successful musician. Now, what has made this possible is that there is a tremendous trove of letters between William in Yorkshire and his brother, who went back to Hanover. He covered 2.5 years, and there's about 250 extant pages. There's 118 missing pages. We know they're missing because William numbered the letters the pages as he sent them out, and he retrieved them all on his first trip back to Hanover in 1764. Why the gaps? Were they embarrassing? Were they just music? The pages are full of music that he just wanted to have for other reasons. Did somebody else borrow them? We just don't know. Sarah and I are trying to figure this out. The letters are in 3 languages, 78% German, 11% each of French and English. And as you see, it tends to be different topics depending on what language William decided to use. We only have 1 letter from Germany, uh, from Jacob, I'm sorry. This is all one way from William that we have. Why he didn't keep all of Jacob's letters, I don't know. And much later, he classified these letters in these what look like quaint categories now: moral, metaphysical, characteristic, sentimental, bantering, satirical, sportful. That's the ladies. We'll come to that in a bit. Why has this not been studied long ago? Sarah and I are the first ones to really mine this. Well, first, the lack of interest, because they're not relevant to Herschel's astronomy. That's all anyone should care about is astronomy. Secondly, the main topic is 18th century music criticism, theory and technique. You need a musicologist as part of it. And that's why Sarah and I have linked up. The letters are still held privately, and that makes them not as available as the ones that are on the Royal Astronomical Society DVDs. And the German, which dominates, as you saw, takes great skill to transcribe. You can read his handwriting very well in English and French, but not in German unless you're trained in it. And the translation is tricky too for the German. So this is why they haven't been looked at very much before, except mainly the ones in English. Here's a page where all three languages are used in the same page, not alone the same letter. A typical letter was a few pages long. And here I give the topic. He switches in mid-sentence from English to Francais, French. And down at the bottom, you see the script that I'm talking about that was used in German at that time. Which just ain't the same as we're used to in English-speaking countries. So here's a map of, you remember in England, I was showing you where Yorkshire was. This is looking at a region that's about 100 miles long. And here you see him going around for about 7 years in this area. Starting in 1760, he went up to Richmond. And these are 20-mile circles that was kind of his area. And then he went up to Newcastle, lived in Sunderland, then down, all the way back down to here in this general region for the rest of his tour. But unfortunately, the letters run out. Remember, the letters only go to mid-1763. So we have kind of a black hole of letters in the middle there. This is looking at his lifetime from not the geographical point of view, but a timeline. But here you see from London to Richmond to Newcastle, then back down south, southern Yorkshire in the Leeds area, and then eventually to Bath in 1766. But the letters only cover this area in red. And there's a gap in the letters to boot, which we wish we didn't have. And so this leads to just not much knowledge at all of before and after this letter period. And so now we'll look at various aspects of William's life over these music years. And I'm fascinated with the horses. And you see that I've got a scale on that map that I was showing you for 20 miles here, but that's also 5 hours of horse riding. And that's how he got around, primarily giving his music lessons. That's how a musician made their money. It wasn't from, unless they were very famous, from performing. And it wasn't from composing. Most stuff was not written up to be composed at all. I'm sorry, to be printed at all. And so Herschel spent hours and hours and hours on horses. His records for long horse trips were like almost 200 miles over 9 days, almost 300 over 16 days, 400 miles over 16 days. Incredible. And trying to make some estimates here, 9 hours in the saddle, 35 miles, in very cold weather and very little daylight. This was done in January. Just grueling things. In Halifax, where we begin to have the last year in Yorkshire, we begin to have better records. we can put together his total mileage. It was about 2,100 miles in the saddle over 11 months period. I'll just mention that another person that was doing an awful lot more on horseback, even more than Herschel, during this years, a little bit, just a tad earlier, but they did overlap, was John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. Here's a couple anecdotes about the troubles you can get into. You shouldn't be riding at night at all. You could have moonlight and then you could ride. But here he started out at 9 o'clock and he still had 20 miles to go. Well, there must have been a little bit of moonlight. There was, because we know the date. But then all of a sudden a severe thunderstorm came for 3 hours. And you can see how scared he became of it. And he just kept riding. I set my path with unrelenting coolness, blinding lightning and thunder. Had to go along with my eyes closed. Eventually the horse wouldn't go anywhere. So he found a house, he knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and then he started out at 3 o'clock and went for another few hours till he got to Richmond. You might say 3 o'clock, well, that was dawn because this is right near the summer solstice in England, and you have very short nights at that latitude. Two more stories on horses. This one was that I happened to be thinking of death as I was going along, and of the order that we observe in all created things, although there are many seeming imperfections. I told myself everything is in order. Then by some accident, I instantly fell violently from my horse. And when I raised myself without being hurt, I said, it would have been better it would have been better that thou hadst broke thy neck than that the laws of motion should have been altered for thy sake. Now there's a person that believes in an orderly universe and just has an idea of where he should be in it. And John Herschel asked his father about anecdotes and things he remembered at age 80, a few years before he died. And he says, father was very fond of the philosopher Epictetus, will come to him. Once he was reading him while riding horseback and suddenly found himself standing in front of the horse with the book in his hand, having slipped over the horse's head. So the horse must have stopped, put his head down, and laws of physics, once again, Herschel slid down over the head, and there he was holding the book. And whether he lost his place in the volume, he doesn't say. But a lot of reading, which John Wesley did also as he rode around. The autodidact. Herschel was largely self-taught. He did have a tutor that his father paid for a couple of years after he graduated from the local garrison school. That was at age 14. And he, very early on, he says later on, dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge, which I regarded as the sovereign good, and in which I resolved to place all my future views of happiness in life. And he studied all these different languages while he was in Yorkshire. And then he got onto mathematics through a book called Harmonics by one Dr. Smith, a Cambridge Don. And by this, I was drawn onto mathematics because music and mathematics are quite related. And you notice at the bottom, he says, my philosophy has retired with me in a corner of my chambers. There contented I sit and can spare almost all the world. My happiness lies within the space of half a dozen yards square. He's happy as a clam, just reading and improving himself. And here's that book on the left, written about 20 years before, 15 years before he read it. And this book on harmonics, which you would expect a musician to be reading, however, has a good bit of math in it. And this led him on to another book that Robert Smith wrote called A Complete System of Optics. And that has one section which is about optics and telescopes. It looks at optics from many different points of view in terms of the practices of making a mirror or a lens, the mathematics of it, but also looks at something about astronomy. And this is where he first really became exposed to astronomy, although he does not do more than just comment on it a little bit. So how did his education rate? Well, one way to look at this is the traditional 7 liberal arts that go back to Plato. They were the basis of any proper university education from the oldest in Bologna until Herschel's time. You had the trivium, which were 3 topics: rhetoric, logic, and grammar, and the quadrivium, which were arithmetic and geometry and music. And what was that 4th one? Well, many of you know, and others of you, I suspect, don't. And that 4th one is astronomy. These were the 7 things that you spent your years in university learning about. And it turns out that Herschel essentially, by himself, got well trained in all of these things, and except for writings. With the grammar, you learned languages, but you also read the classics. And Herschel was not really interested in literature of any kind, fiction or nonfiction. But everything else is covered in his. I've got to go much faster here. He was strongly influenced by John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And he put together himself, in the middle of these letters, a treatise on the nature of existence. Locke is a founder of British empiricism, and this is very relevant to the tremendous amount of data that William gathered as a way to find out about the universe. He believed in a creator, but he was certainly not a Christian. He was more a deist. He also got from John Locke the principle of plenitude, which was that God would not have made all these other planets and stars that we know about unless there was a purpose for them. And the purpose is that, like our own planet, that they be occupied, that they be inhabited. And they probably are occupied by superior beings to us. It's not clear, but they are inhabited. And that was something that was very important for his science later in his career. And here's the front of that book by John Locke. And Herschel's actual signature down there when he bought it as a teenager. He said to learn his English better. Quite a book to start off learning your English. And then the other kind of that he got into was Stoicism. And Epictetus is not too well known to most people, but he was one of the most influential developers of Stoic ethics. And William made a great effort as a man in his 20s to apply these principles to his own life. In one letter, he says, "I love this Epictetus so much." And the English translation he was reading was in verse, and you can see the verse here down below. Don't worry about what other people are saying about you or how, what's happening to them. Just be concerned about you. You can only affect the things that you can affect. And you can't affect things outside. You just have to live with them and don't let it mess up your life. They can hinder other people, but don't let them hinder you. And you can see his Stoic attitudes much later on when he's an astronomer also. He was a workaholic. And my passions are like strings too highly strung. Internal restlessness that he has. All of these are quotes from the letters. And here's another place where you see his stoicism. He cuts off roughly half his nail and a big piece of my left thumb with a penknife, thus making the left hand unusable for perhaps a month. The surgeon assures me, however, that it's not significant. Pain is no evil. So in Stoicism, you accept the world as it is. You don't get too hung up on it. And so that's never been pointed out before, that he went through life with missing half of his thumbnail. Fortunately, it was not in his not cut off more in terms of playing the violin. But then after 3 weeks, he begins to pick up his former spirit, and he's working with his students and composing and playing again. He got transformed into an Englishman during these years. I think I'll skip the top one there. After 5 years in England, he admitted to his brother Jacob in Hanover, "I am almost an Englishman, and am so accustomed to the way of life here, as well as the current customs, that my homeland will not suit me." How much time, please, Steve?
What do you got? About 10 minutes.
Thank you. Herschel and women. Case number 1, Mrs. Dixon. This is the only comment about her, but it's just so intriguing. I just wrote a letter to Mrs. Dixon, responding to her last, in which she complains of my coldness when I wrote that in truth, I no longer love her, which implies that he did love her. However, in order to be accused of fickleness, I offered her my friendship or my goodwill. I told her that I have not at all changed, but that I have ceased loving. And he says, why is she so upset? You know, can't we just be friends? We've all heard this before. But I assume that this was not an affair. I assume that Mrs. Dixon was a widow, but we don't know. He's 22 at this time. The one that we have the most evidence about is one that he calls Mademoiselle. Unfortunately, he doesn't give a name to her beyond that. But he was really head over heels with her. Primarily, he only met her a half a dozen times. It was primarily through 50 letters. We don't have them all, but he refers to about 50 letters. We don't have any of them, in fact. Those he did not preserve for posterity. But you see that he loves her intellectuality as well as her sentiments, her knowledge of the human heart. She writes me like a friend and with frankness, without being delicate or reserved. You know, she was a real friend. 2.5 months later, he's been going over a dozen letters that he has from her. They're metaphysical and they're moral. She's certainly vastly superior to all those I'm acquainted with of her sex. I have not seen her these 6 months, and indeed never saw her above 5 or 6 times. I've written 3 times more letters to her than she has to me. And then 4 months later, I miss her beautiful eyes. I can hardly remember. Poor young lady, he says. Now, why is he saying that? And then 3 weeks later, he's crushed. I've just got a letter that increased my sad state yet more. Here in the loneliness, isolated from all human society, sits the poor philosopher. He must have gotten a Dear William letter. But this is all he ever says about it. He doesn't say exactly what that letter was. But 3 months later, he's on the mend, as you see here. And then a year later, thinks he doesn't even need a muse. When a person mingles with love, he hardly composes. Why not? I used to think that it would be necessary to love to be inspired and to compose better. He finally got married at age 49 to a rich widow, 25 years later. And he could get lonely and discouraged. This was after being a year in Yorkshire. He said, is it not amazing that in the 3 years that I've been in England, I have not met a single person which I have valued as worthy of my friendship? Now, he may have a high bar for being worthy of his friendship, but quite a statement. And then he says, I've resolved not to be a great man. I've given up greatness and shall content myself with living in obscurity. Well, he got out of that funk, I think, and then he ended up becoming a great man. Now let's take a look at some of the patrons that he was able to find. This would be the ideal thing. You hook up with a rich guy, and you could spend a week at his place, and maybe he would invite you back for another week a couple months later, and you could compose there, and you'd have room and board and good food, and he would have interesting friends. And he was able to pull this off in 3 different places. Holnaby Hall is one of them, which is near Richmond. And this is Ralph Milbank and his daughter Elizabeth, who became, those of you know some English history, quite a notorious socialite. Elizabeth Lamb was her married name. She's also the grandmother of Ada Lovelace, famous for those of you who know the history of computing in the 19th century.
5 minutes, Woody.
Pardon?
That's your 5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you. And here is one thing that happened there was that the Duke of York, the brother of the new king, George III, came for a few days, and she invited the Holnaby family invited him and a couple other composers, and he thought that that might really go places, but it didn't in terms of getting him into royal circles. He had to discover another plan for that to happen. He then went up to Newcastle, and he did another one of these trips that I talked about, going up to Edinburgh, auditioning for a job, which he didn't get. But he did have dinner with David Hume, one of the other great philosophers of the British philosophers of the 18th century. It doesn't say anything more about what they talked about at dinner. And then this is probably the biggest audience he ever had for a concert that he gave. On the coronation of George III in 1761, he led a band of 30 musicians. There were about 300 listeners there. And then down to a place called Wheatley Hall. And a very sad thing happened there. He spent a week there, as he often did over a few years. He came out after 1 week. My mare had been standing idly in the stable and was overfed by Sir Brian's grooms, died. That would be a bit disappointing. It's like coming out to your car and you got a dead battery. And worse than that. And then the final place is Nether Hall, which had a intellectual salon pretty much once a month on Sundays in particular. And one person remembered that Herschel's playing was just marvelous and that he was one of the highlights of those intellectual salons. Now, Leeds is the primary city in Yorkshire at that time in terms of size and wealth. But we have this great black hole when the letters to Jacob cease. So we just don't know much about the Leeds story except some newspaper notices and some later reminiscences. He had a couple series of concerts that were very successful, but the third winter when he advertised it, he didn't get sufficient subscribers. And so the whole thing had to be scrapped. He went back to see his family in Hanover after finally securing proper military discharge papers. Remember, he was officially a deserter. And his main income during all this time, I want to remind you, was going around giving lessons to what he called his scholars, his music students, who could be women, typically playing the guitar or the harpsichord, or children, violin, oboe, harpsichord. He taught them all. And I'll skip this. Finally, when we get to Halifax, we finally have some good records. And it's a fascinating story, but I'm running out of time to tell it. He gets hooked up with something called the Messiah Club because they are practicing to play Handel's famous oratorio, Messiah, which had only been written 20 years before. Now, we don't know that this photo painting is of the Messiah Club, but it's a very similar club in Halifax if it's not the Messiah Club. But he rehearsed them for a production of the Messiah that was done on 2 days in the summer of 1766. The purpose of those 2 days was not just the Messiah, but was also to dedicate a brand new organ in the Halifax Parish Church. They raised the equivalent today of $2 million US dollars, 12,000 pounds at that time.
1 minute.
The organ itself only cost 2,000 pounds, it turned out. And they spent the rest of it as an endowment and for other things in the church. Here's the Halifax Church, which you can still visit today. Very, very nice to visit, although the organ unfortunately does not exist anymore. And here's the announcement. At the top, you see on Thursday and Friday, the 28th of August, will be this performed. The Messiah, an oratorio composed by Mr. Handel between the first and second acts, will be a concerto on the organ. And that was not played by Herschel, however. But at the bottom, an organist is wanted. Any person who is inclined to offer himself as a candidate, apply. Well, he got the job, but then at the same time, an unsolicited, fantastic offer from distant Bath, 200 miles to the south, arrived. And Herschel was in a pickle. He just committed himself to being organist on this nice new organ. And yet in Bath, they were saying, we'll pay you more. We've got an even better organ made by the same organist in London.
Woody, we're out of time.
Okay, in a much more fashionable resort, and therefore he had to give up. Well, here are some of the traits that you've been seeing of William Herschel over these years. And as Wordsworth said, the child is father of the man. Sarah, in the next talk, will be talking about some of our conclusions about how these are important also in the astronomy part of his life, not just the music part. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Woody. Again, we'll have time for questions at the very end as well, if you have specific questions about Woody's presentation. And Woody, let's make sure that you unshare your screen so Sarah can share hers.
Thank you.
While he's doing that, I'd like to introduce Sarah Clemens-Walls, who holds an undergraduate degree in physics from Oberlin College and a PhD in musicology from Yale University. She teaches music history at the University of the Pacific, and apart from Herschel, researches music of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, including music in England, the spread of Scottish music, German Romanticism, pre-Romanticism, and Beethoven. All right, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I would just like to start by noting that this work was supported by the Dudley Observatory's Herbert C. Pollack Award for Research in the History of Astronomy, and my gratitude for that support. You're no doubt aware, William Herschel contributed to a radical shift of human understanding of our place in the universe, summarized by his 1781 identification of an object in the sky as a planet, the planet we now know as Uranus, but not limited to that. We can also appreciate how this would have fundamentally disrupted the cosmology that Europeans had known since antiquity. And we know that for decades, Herschel's name was used as a stand-in for astronomy and even for science in general. How salient then that when the letter came on April 23rd, 1781, confirming the discovery of a new planet, it was addressed to Mr. William Herschel, musician. Because despite all of his telescope and astronomical researches, Herschel was a professional musician. As Woody noted, the discovery neatly bisects Herschel's life, and that although he was a musician as young as 4 by his own recollection, the time of interest for us is the second quarter of his life, the so-called music years, from about 1760 to 1781, comprising his 20s and 30s. And just to show that blown up a bit, you can see, and Woody covered this all very well, that there's a kind of preamble in London with copying. His move to Yorkshire initiates a period of rapid moves from then Leeds to Halifax and then to Bath, when he had his big break as organist of the Octagon Chapel, along with many other duties. And of course, it's also the period where he began dividing his efforts with telescope building and observation. And the documents I've been investigating, along with Woody, are the correspondence with Jacob, as he noted, and then a music treatise from these times, which he was sort of practicing for while he was writing to Jacob. So I've been able to use both of those. And just as a sort of overview, what kind of world of music did Herschel inhabit? Or maybe how does he compose with other composers you might know of? So this is just a little music history overview. We note that the so-called Baroque period of music is usually considered to have expired with the last breaths of Johann Sebastian Bach in 1750. But then Handel, who's the darling of Herschel's England for his Messiah and other oratorios, is also considered to be Baroque. Both of these composers had forays into a new sort of simplicity that emerged around 1730 called galant style. And it's just a very major mode music with plain 8-bar phrases, and it includes new genres like the symphony. The symphony was then considered a genre of light entertainment rather than a weighty philosophical work, as Beethoven would write. And Bach's youngest son, Johann Christian Bach, came to London just about the same time as Herschel and had a famous career there, and he is considered an exponent of the galant style. There's also a kind of special complication of gallant style that was popular around Berlin in the 1750s and 60s, particularly with the court of Friedrich the Great, which you probably hear more about with David Kerner's paper. And we might call that sensitivity or Empfindsamkeit. And another Bach's son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, is considered an exponent of this style. And it seems that Herschel was influenced by that sort of before he left Hanover. All of those styles eventually coalesce into the high classical style under which we would class Mozart and Haydn, whereas the various emotional pre-romantic styles will inevitably shade into 19th century romanticism, under which I would class Beethoven. And if there's anyone who wants to fight me on these associations and dates, I'm happy to meet you out back after the talk. So you'll see that these music years of Herschel are a little bit of a transition period, not to say dead space, of course, but that one single style isn't dominant. Herschel himself moves from this more emotional style to more restrained gallant style music. And I don't think it's, as people have surmised, trenching to suit the demands of the lowbrow English. But Herschel himself articulates that his tastes are becoming more refined, and he views simplicity and restraint as a higher order of musical goals. And while we have a minute here, I think we can hear some of this. Now, Herschel wrote all of his symphonies kind of within a few years of each other, so you can't necessarily, I mean, they're going to sound a little similar. But we have this more emotional style sort of at the beginning with his C minor symphony, and we can have a page or two of that and see how nice his handwriting is. You can see and hear what that is like. And we're all hearing nothing. Is that right?
No, that was coming through.
Yeah, we could hear it.
Oh, it was. I'm just hearing nothing. Okay. Let me start it again then. Fair start.
But now I don't hear it.
All right, well, possibly not worth going into, but let me just take 1 second to make sure that the output volume is correct. Now, how does it sound like?
I don't hear it now, Sarah.
Yes, but do you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you.
Okay. Let's just continue. Here is the later example from, and again, it's just a little year later, but it's definitely more of a gallant simplicity. Okay. All right, how are we doing now?
I heard the sound. Now I don't hear it, but we hear you.
Okay, fine. I am having a little bit of problems, so I'm going to skip the rest of this and continue. Okay. So, you can see, we can take a little moment to note the most comparable musicians in terms of age and situation are Joseph Haydn and J.C. Bach. Indeed, the most comparable in terms of career would include the slightly older Charles Avison, with whom Herschel worked and whom he admired, and the music historian Charles Burney, of whom we'll hear more later. Incidentally, some of you might have heard that Haydn and Herschel met at one point, which is not true, although Haydn did take a tour of the telescope on his visit to London in the 1790s. Herschel's letters show that he's aware of J.C. Bach in London and has admiration for him. The rest of my talk is going to be questions, almost all supporting the main question I think is in people's minds, which is, was Herschel a good composer? The standard biographical narrative suggests that he found his true calling when he leapt into astronomy seems to imply that no, music was not his true calling. But I mean to challenge that. With the help of Herschel's correspondence, Woody and I have taken the view that Herschel is always himself, and it's not so much Herschel's abilities that inhibit or promote him, but the situation in which they're found. So the 4 questions are, was Herschel considered to be successful? Why are his works relatively poorly known? Are there really no early hints to his later turn to astronomy? And why did he apparently never look once he discovered the planet? So taking them in turn, was Herschel successful? Well, what does it mean to be successful? To answer that, we might have to think about success as divorced from composition. That is, to stop thinking of Herschel, or indeed any 18th century figure, as a composer with a capital C, and think of them rather as a musician. Deborah Rohr, in her book, The Careers of British Musicians, 1750 to 1850, gives 10 rules for the musical practitioner in 18th century Britain that I've condensed here. And we can see that Herschel's behavior is quite a bit adapted to these rules, particularly in the Yorkshire years. And the first, as Woody alluded to, money doesn't come from composition. Your money comes from an endless round of students, and to a lesser extent from performance. That's a check. All that riding around Yorkshire was far more for the purpose of giving lessons than for preparing big concerts, which could pay off, but were also important for spreading your name and getting you more students. So yes, Herschel was writing music to play it, not to sell it. Being as versatile as possible, check. He played and taught oboe, violin, viola, and keyboard, harpsichord, and organ, and it wasn't really so unusual to play so many instruments and teach on all of them, nor was it really any kind of career switching to move from concert and choir directing to organ work. Another is to save up for bad times by taking on as much drudgery as you can while exploiting every big opportunity, whatever the risk. Again, for Herschel, that is a check. That's the rule that Herschel seems to have internalized letters, complaining to his brother about the drudgery, but also insisting that it's all necessary until he can get a little bit more of a cushion. Cultivating regional networks and following the money. And that's exactly what Herschel did, and it worked for him. It got him from the little militia band work to bigger and bigger positions up to Bath. He wasn't really able to create a monopoly. So he worked toward that goal, but it's more like he threatened other people's monopolies. Establishing and holding on to an institutional base, even though it's not the major income source, that's also a check for Herschel, beginning with the militia band at Darlington and ending with the Octagon Chapel at Bath. Herschel always had a main gig, and that main gig did not really describe what took up most of his activity, and not special to him. And then finally for this list, it was important to remain connected with London, but that was Herschel's big fail. He did not remain connected with London, but was it really detrimental for his musical career? Most likely not. He is pretty dissatisfied with the idea of London. And he said he's dissatisfied with Yorkshire as well. He says, I am, as it were, buried here in Yorkshire. But he was also pretty vocal about detesting London As he wrote to his brother, as far as London is concerned, I have not the least curiosity, and if my things go off, not the least reason to desire to go back there. One wonders why he was so averse to London. We know that he put on 2 concerts there, but only 2 concerts that we know of. The second saw him as leader, first with solos, and also featured the German violin prodigy, 11-year-old Gertrude Schmeling. It is really rare to find an adult woman playing violin in England in the 18th century. I actually don't know of any. Schmeling was induced by her English friends to give up violin and develop her voice instead. But she became the illustrious Madame Mara as an adult, and she recollected this very set of years in her memoirs, saying, "London is probably the worst place in the world for an artist who is not on the list, whom people are not already waiting for and excited about. Whoever goes there on his own initiative without great fame, even if his talent is just as great, must support himself 3 or indeed 6 months in order to become known, that is, to receive patronage. 2 years without any similar success." And so Madame Mara's recollection is fully consistent with Herschel's retrospective observation that in those years, London was so overstocked with musicians that we had but little chance of any good success. So to describe what might count as a Herschel success, we can look at a concert that was given in Leeds in May 1765, advertised in the Leeds Intelligencer. It's a concert for the benefit of Mr. Herschel. Unlike today, benefit concerts go to benefit the musician giving it, as opposed to a subscription concert. A concert in this time period is typically a hodgepodge of vocal and instrumental works, usually by friends of the giver or the giver him or herself. And much less hodgepodgey than usual. Instead of being broken up with arias and songs, all the music is instrumental music. Only a few composers are given, Handel and Martini, and the performers are not given at all. Still, we can expect that if the soloist is not named and the instrument is one that Herschel plays, it's probably him. So here we can assume that the violin solo on the bottom is played by Herschel, and possibly also the harpsichord concerto. Concert is concerto. We have no record that he wrote a harpsichord concerto, and it's not a guarantee that this means it was composed by him, but it is possible. We can also assume that the symphonies are Herschel's, as he wrote some in Leeds, and moreover, that says it has clarinets, must be one of the symphonies that has clarinet parts, which would be, let's see, 20, 22, or 23. So the real issue is that success in England just doesn't equate with compositional fame or even ability, and that's an ahistoric or retrospective approach. Composition at this time is only one facet of a musical career. Not even J.S. Bach or anyone so famous as that to us now really expected their works to live on after them. No one, not even Mozart or Beethoven, made a living solely from composing or publishing, but rather from a combination of musical activities. Everyone in this time period expectation that they themselves will be performing or seeing the performance through, with the exception maybe of opera or church music. So that leads us kind of obviously to the second point, which is why are Herschel's compositions relatively unknown? And first, you might care to go over what are his compositions. In instrumental music, he wrote about 24 symphonies in 5 years. That's all in the Yorkshire period. Between about 12 and 14 concertos, highlighting various solo instruments, the organ ones coming from his later period, several harpsichord sonatas, which include almost his only published opus, and some violin solos, and then about 100 extant organ works. And we can't guarantee that those are his only works. They're just the ones that we still have. In vocal music, we have more holes. We have evidence of an oratorio that's unfinished. We have one successful catch, which is kind of a glee club type work that was published, and then various other works in various states of completion, and some church music, which Carolyn suggests is just a small fraction of what once existed. In terms of production, Well, how should we value that? One thing we could do is say, well, what had, say, Joseph Haydn written by the same time period? So they're about the same age through 1781. What had Haydn gotten up to? And if we look just at the instrumental music, in the same time period, Haydn wrote about 3 times as many symphonies, plus 10 overtures, about the same number of concertos, but a whole lot more chamber music. Herschel has no counterpart, string quartets and so forth. About 6 times the number of keyboard sonatas and trios. And then, although Haydn didn't write very much organ music, he did write a whole lot of works for the instrument that his patron played, the baritone. So it's possible to consider that in terms of opportunity. Haydn, of course, had a standing orchestra at the ready in his position at Esterhazy, and there were opportunities for his music to be heard almost constantly. Whereas Herschel's instrumental music is clearly going in phases depending on what his position at the time seemed to require. Nevertheless, Haydn is on the whole more prolific. If we compare rather to someone in Herschel's orbit, the highly successful Charles Avison, we can see that in terms of, absolute number of works, Herschel is comparable to Avison. The genres are not really comparable because Avison's writing in more old-fashioned genres. But one thing is that almost all of Avison's works have opus numbers, meaning that they are published. So he had at least 10 published opuses, each with about 6 to 12 compositions. Herschel, on the other hand, published, again, almost none of his works, and particularly did not publish the symphonies or organ music, though they were likely all performed. And then you might ask, well, why is this? It's not necessarily meaningful, although in the letters, Herschel is often self-critical about his early works. The lack of publication doesn't imply that they had shortcomings, or that anybody didn't want to publish them. In fact, it was very common not to publish works that you're still using. There's no way to publish it, anybody can have it and do what they want with it. And, that they're no longer new at that point, and what is new is what is most valuable at this time. Nevertheless, it does make a difference to reception because after Herschel left music, his works were not easily available to be played. And because even composers like Vivaldi fell into a period of obscurity in the 19th century, and so many things about instrument construction and performance practice changed in the 19th century, it's taken time to unearth the unwritten conventions and the music of the time period. So then, to a certain extent, Herschel's music is only beginning to have its moment, and more of it is available now than there ever was, except maybe in Herschel's own house. But there are some other factors, and most of them are Herschel himself. Like maybe he got in his own way a little bit. Despite his success in Yorkshire in acquiring students and making opportunities, Herschel's approach to music concerts was not businesslike. He had an anti-mercenary approach. He failed to advertise his concerts very well, or to put on the sort of things that would attract a lot of attention. Note again, the Leeds concert was pretty serious, it's all instrumental, whereas viewers who were used to more of a hodgepodge might have found that a little tedious. And it also leads to not very many records for us now. Many people praised his chaste performance style, as Woody showed you, and as became controversial with the Halifax Messiah Club, he was known as a stickler for correct, whereas the performing groups, such as the Messiah Club, might have preferred to rehearse a little bit less and drink beer in the tavern afterwards a little bit more. So his concert series in Leeds and Bath were unsuccessful, not because they were poorly prepared at all, but because much more emphasis was put on musical preparedness than on advertising and attracting audiences. In the end, though, the real issue is his astronomy, and not the fact that he turned to it, but his extreme fame as an astronomer got in the way because it overshadowed the musical part of his career and turned it into a curiosity at best. Let's move on to the third question, which is, are there really no early hints to his later turn to astronomy? This is there's precious few. Of course, there's no tantalizing works about science or math. There's no comparable work to Holst the Planets or something like that. But still, as it's our contention that Herschel's a consistent personality throughout, and his talents evolve out of his predilections. Woody already told you that music is one of the sciences of the quadrivium, and it was Herschel's reading of Smith's harmonics which led him towards Smith's optics and thus to telescope building. More than that, though, Herschel would not have been reading Smith's harmonics unless he'd already been wanting to develop the side of music that dealt with ratio, proportion, and tuning, as it's perfectly possible to be a successful musician without ever understanding it. And in Herschel's own recollection, he's viewing music quadrivially as a branch of mathematics. And again, we've already seen theory of music is connected with mathematics, and later says that he's moving from one branch of mathematics to another when he moves to optics. However, Herschel was also skeptical of facile associations between the quadrivial arts and seemed to downplay any real association of mathematics and music when corresponding with his brother. Evidently, the two had been writing about the opinions of the mathematician and composer Lorenz Christoph Mitzler, who in 1738 had founded a corresponding society of musical science, whose members included Bach. And indeed, this famous portrait of Bach was commissioned on entry to this society. And what Herschel said to his brother was, concerning Professor Mitzler's opinion, I indeed admit that mathematics has some influence on music. This comes through and sharpens our perspective, and not that it immediately opens up to us the nature of tones. This it does by no means, at least not in a musical understanding. Now, Mitzler's society was all but defunct by 1761, and it's unclear what exact opinion they're responding to, but I'm starting to feel that they most likely read it in this Musikalische Bibliothek, which connected music with mathematics, philosophy, and the fine arts. So I'm hoping to look more into that. Then we follow up this in the next letter. About a month later, Herschel says, yesterday I was able to have a conversation with two learned people with whom I have the honor to be acquainted concerning the influence of mathematics on music. They both opined that math was just as important in music as in astronomy. I'd love to know who these people were, but also this is one of the few direct mentions of astronomy, and it indicates that it was a topic of conversation. But he then goes on to kind of downplay it, saying, I undertook to opine that it could by no means have any direct influence, although I don't deny it could be very useful to a musician because it moves him to seek out the foundations of music and to take nothing as correct that he is not convinced of. Mathematics has this use in all the sciences, that it makes us keen. So he's saying, it, again, like previously, it sharpens our perceptions, but it also cannot assist us particularly in music, because one need be no mathematician to understand music, and the best mathematician, if he has not learned music, knows nothing of it. Indeed, with all of his mathematics, he cannot even set a base to the folk song. Thus, adieu mathematics and music. So it's not necessarily in this quadrivial shift that we see the future of Herschel as a scientist, but more in his systematic approach to music. As he writes to his brother, he incorporates huge passages that are clearly preparations for a music treatise and shows us his systematic and empirical thinking. He made a thorough study of time signatures, for example, and explained, in grueling detail how they're all reducible to duple and triple meter with various subdivisions, and has a whole system of accents that comes out of it. He made a thorough study of tempos and devised a way to estimate metronome markings for each tempo, which is some 50 years before the metronome we're familiar with, the Metzel metronome, was in use. He claimed to have arrived at them empirically by saying how many measures can you get through in 5 minutes. He also made a thorough study of dissonances, claiming that they're reducible to 20 and showing every possible resolution, which is an empirical approach that expanded actually the range of allowable dissonances and resolutions compared to his predecessors. So just to show you a little bit more of his systematic thought, this is a section from the letters. It's a table of 79 ways of proceeding in parallel motion. And he just gives you every choice, 2 on C to 1 step apart, 2 to 2 steps apart, to 3 to 4, all the way up. And then we're going to start C and D together and continue on. Oh, now third. He wrote out every possibility, and that's just sort of how he is. Here's another slide, which looks for all the world like a musical composition, but it's actually an exercise in which he tries to incorporate every dissonance and every possible resolution of that dissonance, running to 3 pages and 139 bars. And I think maybe it's not irrelevant that he's doing these exercises in the very weeks that he's talking about Mitzler with his brother in the letters. Well, all of that systematic thinking coalesces in his unpublished treatise here. This is a kind of ground up treatise about how music works. It's not like Aveson's treatise on musical expression. It could be read by someone who didn't know anything about music. It's extremely systematic. One of the few times that Herschel alludes to anything to do with astronomy or physics in the Yorkshire years has to do with his chapter on gravity. It's a theory of modulation and key change, what he was already talking about with Jacob, but he calls it gravity in 1763 and 6 when he's reading about optics, and talks about degrees of gravity. And there's an entire chapter on gravity. Herschel himself shows himself caught, here it is, the chapter 16 on gravity. It's another example of really systematic thinking. Herschel does note that it's kind of a weird phrase to use. He's never before used in musical signification. And it is about expression and modulation. The idea is that the desire of certain intervals to resolve tonally is maybe metaphorically similar to gravitational attraction, and that the more distant the key, as defined by fifth relations, the more degrees of gravity it has, and thus the more expressive. So here's the corresponding portion from the letters, which are just kind of easier to read than the treatise. And he first points out, so it's all the pitches are stretched out in ascending fifths. If that matters to you, that's fine. And you can see that he says that the greater the distance on the chart between 2 pitches, the greater the degree of gravity. So from, say, G sharp to F, more gravity than, say, B to F. And it's interesting that he speaks of them as having more gravity when they're further apart. One gets rather the sense of, kind of expressive or, potential energy with each successive fifth getting further and further from the tonic and accumulating a potential that collapses when resolved. So similarly, the more keys that your work touches on, the greater the degree of gravity it has. In the end, although Herschel is personally comfortable with a very narrow range of dissonances and modulations, he may have experimented a lot in his improvisation, particularly as an organist in Bath. It's also interesting that his approach is very rule-bound, but also very creative. A lot of people have used this statement to kind of poke fun at Herschel, because he says, "It is only too bad that music is not yet 100 times more difficult a science than it is. I formerly found a certain satisfaction to think how many difficulties I still had to overcome. Now, however, I could wish they were even more." And so the idea is like, well, if you were a better composer, maybe maybe you would find it a little more difficult. Okay, but this is actually in the context of saying that he has this drive to composition. He says, "My thoughts are so much drawn to composition that I can scarcely rest without having the quill in my hand. It is a kind of plague that cannot be withstood." And then he continues to say, when one has the theory of music fully in his possession, then it's time to let his genius run free out. Rules are only made for people who do not understand music, because one who is a mature theorist can endure nothing irregular and thus cannot bring it to light. The thoughts of a mature theorist are rules. So that's just to say, I mean, yes, he's very, he believes in an ordered universe, as Woody said, but it allows him to actually be creative in an interesting way. So finally, and just very briefly, why did he in fact not look back after he discovered the planet Uranus? And there's a few things going on here. One, in the narrative that suggests Herschel found his true calling with telescopes and astronomy, the implication is that Herschel viewed music as a means to an end, which he was glad to give up when he found something more fulfilling. There are some things that argue for that. When we look back at those 10 rules for the general practitioner, we can note that they're so tedious. The endless round of students, the endless miles on horseback, the need to take on drudgery at the best of times, to grasp at all opportunities. And Herschel's letters to his brother highlight this. And again, many have noted the statement he wrote to his brother in April 1761, because it's in English. I have already some time ago, that's his English, been thinking of leaving off professing music, and the first opportunity that presents itself, I shall really do so. It's all very well in your way when one has a fixed salary, but to take so much for concert, so much for teaching, and so much for benefit is what I do not like at all. And rather than go on in that way, I would take any opportunity of leaving off music. But again, the end of the quote is often left off. Not that it should always be my chief study, though I had another, but music ought not to be treated on that mercenary footing. And it is indeed those mercenary aspects that seem to grate on Herschel. Making good music motivated him more than being successful. And although he took a significant pay cut for the privilege of leaving music, half of his salary, which obviously suggests a love for astronomy, but also a loathing of the maybe hustle culture of music making. We do know, and I can't talk about it much, that there are indications he continued participating in music even after he left Bath. He had access to the King's music room and evening soirees and was likely on hand for many of them. His nephews, the Griesbachs, were all playing in the King's band, and it's clear that he was supporting them. And we also have a record of him and a few concerts, which are, it seems like it could have been more than there are records of. So in conclusion, Herschel's personal traits are visible in both the music years and astronomy years, of being hardworking, a stickler for correctness and precision. He's clearly a systematic and empirical thinker, but also heterodox and willing to forego what he has been taught, having an enormous drive to create and work. So perhaps we can think the milieu of 1760s England was perfectly conducive to a good livelihood as a musician, but a bit of a dead end as being, as far as telling a history of progress or firsts, whereas natural philosophy, what we call science, was poised to make cataclysmic change in the Enlightenment. It's not so much that Herschel found his true calling with astronomy, but that his set of traits were better suited for making strides in that field than in music. So in music, he was elaborating a system that was falling out of use, but in astronomy, he ended up being much more of a Beethoven, or a bridge between an older way of thinking and a newer one. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was fascinating. I think we have a minute or two for some quick questions. And I see there's one that looks like it was posed maybe for Woody, but maybe Sarah, you could answer it as well. The question is, what instrument would Herschel have played in the performance of the Messiah? Maybe the one that Woody was alluding to, or maybe the one with the Messiah Club.
Oh, that's a very good question. Leading the concert, which from our perspective would mean conducting, but a conductor at that point conducted either from the keyboard or from the first violin stand. And I'm going to guess he did it from the keyboard. So harpsichord he was playing.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. Well, that puts us...
I'm having a little audio problem.
That puts us pretty much right on time for our next presentation. So I will introduce John Mulligan. John received his PhD in English from Brown University. His writing in digital objects investigate the problem of abstraction in the arts and sciences with a focus on the 18th and 19th centuries. He's published essays on William Blake and Isaac Newton, William Shakespeare and supercomputing, Andreas Vesalius and Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, and the Herschel siblings and Nate Silver. He's currently working on a project treating the recent paintings of Bridget Riley. And John, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Fabulous. And can you see my screen share?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Please chime in if I have any AV difficulties. Your feedback is most welcome. On July 8th, 1783, Caroline Herschel announces a change in her observational procedures. I swept with a Newtonian sweeper, began at Xi Serpentis, and had Alpha Serpentari in the sweep when the screw was at an end. Note my sweeps will be perpendicular in the future. All those before have been horizontal. The horizontal sweeps she is referring to were wide-ranging movements well calibrated to hunting comets. These new vertical sweeps, however, are better suited to systematically searching for deep sky phenomena. Began again with Pi Sagittarii and had Gamma Cygni in the telescope when the screw was at an end. Had a great part of the Milky Way in the sweeps. Nothing nebulous, therefore conclude a stronger power is required. At least in the first of these two sweeps, she must be pointed a little bit east rather than directly south. In late September, she reiterates the specifics of her technique and demonstrates her refinements of it in an explication of the reasoning behind her method. I began to sweep at Alpha Aquarii, and when it was a little past the meridian, and swept as far as Omega Piscium and Pi Andromeda without changing my situation. Note, I have adopted this method ever since the 8th of July, finding by experience that the time of sweeping in the meridian answered to the meridian passage of the stars. This new vertical sweeping technique in the meridian will quickly become de rigueur for their search for deep sky phenomena. And in the course of 2.5 months, Caroline has perfected her method by experience and with reason. She knows that a given field of view in a telescope pointed directly south, there is a rhythm at which a skilled operator can harmonize this instrument's vertical oscillations with the apparent motion of the celestial sphere. Her emphasis on careful and ultimately successful experimentation here makes William's entry of December 13th quite striking in its detailed replication of precisely her methods and reasoning. I now began to sweep in a different manner, which I find much more convenient and also better, as it gives me an opportunity to determine the place that has been examined. The method is as follows. I place the telescope in or near the meridian, then raise and depress it alternately so as to return in a different tract of stars. By experience, I find that my perpendicular sweep may be about 1.5 degrees about the equator, so that now I have zones of sweep that remain between the same parallels. By noting the time of the passage of known stars, I can also determine the RA of unknown objects to a few minutes. And on comparing their altitude with these stars, I can also have the declination to a few minutes. This was William's 42nd numbered sweep. His 46th sweep, taken 5 days later on December 18, is the first that Caroline includes in her full tabulation of the 19-year survey. The next night, December 19, marks the end of her extended run of observations. Her next recorded is February 23rd, then March 8th, then March 12th, then May 12th, 1784. William's shift to vertical sweeps with the 20-foot marks a qualitative shift in the observatory's operations. The two now operate in parallel processes, governed by the synchronization of not only one, as with Caroline's sweeps, their field of view with the meridian passage of the stars, but two, their ability to process information. Caroline pre-processes known stars so that they know what to expect to see and can recognize discoveries faster. William observes and Caroline reads and records, and the two coordinate to determine whether they are looking at something new or a correction to something old, and above all, attempt to stay on schedule in order to ensure that their oscillations will slightly, quote, lap over each other so as to not leave a gap in the band they're sweeping. This division of labor between the visual and the numerical processing allows them to profoundly change their depth of field from searching for comets to remapping the sky so intensively as to give it spatial and temporal depth, or, as Michael Hoskin put it, discovering the universe. Organized with an eye to the minute innovations in technique and labor division in this pivotal year of 1783, as recorded by Caroline, I believe these facts allow us to constellate their labors less in terms of the cooperation of or tensions between two individuals than in terms of the operations of a modern observatory. What would that look like? Let me start by taking a page from Hoskin's book. He provides a striking visual contrast in his popular discoverers of the universe. He juxtaposes the mythical bodies that populate Flamsteed's 1729 Atlas Celestis with Caroline's ruled book of zones that decompose Flamsteed's stars into horizontal bands of polar declination. This contrast is brilliant because it sets the stage for the sibling survey. Now, visualized from the perspective of the observatory, I think it would look something like this. Bands of coverage across various constellations, which taken together constitute their domain and range of knowledge and represent years of physical and intellectual labor. In 2017, Adolfo Carvalho and I recomposed Caroline's tabulation of sweeps and William's logs of observations into a plugin for the Stellarium Planetarium software package that visualizes this coverage and simulates an idealized version of William's view of the sweeps. Caroline's polar declination and right ascension coordinates are fed into the plugin, which renders these as rectangular overlays, and one or more of these sweeps can be played out in an idealized manner in which we assume Caroline and William to be maintaining perfect rhythm in their vertical oscillations in order to achieve total coverage. In order to future-proof the results against any potential breaking changes in the open source code, we published high-resolution, low frame rate videos and screenshots to the web as a cross-linked archive between Twitter and YouTube, creating perhaps the most boring social media channels in existence. But if they are boring, they're also quite tense once you start to pay attention. Cats really like this, but it's like unfollowable as a social media account. If you were to sweep perfectly according to Caroline and William's perfect method, and if you were to catch every object that passed by, then the observer would have to submit to the rigors of the method as much as the recorder would have to submit to the rigors of the observer's reports. The Herschels have, by brilliantly transforming discovery into a matter of information processing, reduced all of their problems into questions of bandwidth, a metaphor nicely literalized by the vertical height of their sweeps. They can sweep just as high as the coordination of their instruments, their communication, and Caroline's data will allow them to accurately process what William can see with his eye. Wolfgang Steineck's brilliant reconstruction of the Herschel's deep sky discoveries contains, as one of its many gems, an accounting of their coverage within those sweeps that rivals Caroline's accounting in its exactitude. And if you haven't seen this book, it's, if you want the full detailed breakdown of this, it's really unparalleled what he did. Based on what they did not observe but might have within these sweep parameters, Steineck estimates a 70% coverage rate within them. William's observations were somewhat more exciting than our simulations, though, because he would sometimes break off the vertical sweeping to track objects of interest. This allowed him to layer in more qualitative descriptions of his discoveries, and in doing so, enrich their collection. But as evidenced by the coverage loss that Steineck quantifies, there was a marginal price of quantity to pay for quality and interestingness. This is a short talk, so I'm going to close with a few remarks on the potential utility of approaching this archive like a set of corporate account books. And in doing so, I will borrow from my home field of literary studies to suggest what this perspective might look like. Specifically, I will be borrowing from work on William and Dorothy Wordsworth, the Herschel's near contemporaries, who likewise collaborated to revolutionize their field of English poetry. This parallel was first noted by Helen Ashton in 1937 and could be usefully taken back up. First, such archival reconstructions might help us to unwind what has been a persistent knot in Herschel scholarship, namely, how do you justly distribute credit between siblings for the revolutionary work? I hope that I've shown that we can both narrativize these micro-innovations, like their vertical sweeping, without overemphasizing anything like the priority of discovery. Instead, we can best understand the significance of such moments by considering how they reorganize the household into an observatory. Hoskin has already gestured towards something like this with the phrase the Herschel partnership, and I would offer up a similar one taken from Lucy Newlin. Describing the Wordsworth's bohemian lifestyle in the late 1790s, Newland cleverly refashions the phrase cottage industry to capture their organization of literary production. And I think that this cottage industrial mode of thinking nicely emphasizes the corporate nature of both families' endeavors. Oh shoot, I wanted to keep that playing. All right, I want to continue to bore you guys with that. Second, I think that such an explicitly corporate framing usefully decouples intellectual labor from intellectual property, keeping in focus both the Herschel's influence and the observatory's obvious power differentials. The trouble with the Herschel's work was that they discovered too much for one person to credibly claim all of it, or even most of it. Again, I would borrow from Wordsworth's studies to articulate the particular dynamic by which the figure of the genius is produced. Elizabeth Fay's brilliant book on the subject describes the distinctive Wordsworthian style as, quote, a product of both their imaginations working together, a team collaboration to which William affixed the name Wordsworth and claimed for his own. I would adumbrate Fay's perspective with Emily Winterburn's notion of Caroline Herschel's, quote, learned modesty, which powerfully emphasizes the fact that her self-erasure was both the result of a lesson she was made to learn and an activity which she was made to carry out herself on herself. Third, I think that by taking in the complex organizational structure of the observatory, we might represent the archive in a manner that harmonizes the micro and macro. I have a Wordsworthian quote here too, of course. Rachel Feder says of Dorothy Wordsworth that, quote, while we may go to the archive to find out what it means to be a woman and a poet in the 19th century, what we learn is what it means to be a person in an archive. I would take her suggestion a bit literally here. The Herschel's astronomical archives as such embody that aspect of Caroline's work that is really easily overlooked when we focus too much on observation. And to a lesser degree, this applies to William as well. Our simulations of William's view underscore the innovativeness of their organization, but also the curious passivity of William's new role, which, in its ideal form, is rather like that of a CCD camera on an automated telescope. I would very much like to recreate more of their observations, and perhaps to make the simulation more representative or even interactive, as the world's least fun 3-player game. But above all, I would like to see a digital edition of the Herschel archives that would facilitate creative and safe reuses like the one that I did here at the RAS, when I overlaid scraps from 2 of Caroline's drafts. Underneath you see an enumeration of the stars not in the British catalog that they found. This is their number 1 calculation. And on top, slips of paper from her working book, quote, first copy and trials from the catalog of stars emitted in the British catalog, to which she added adjustments taken from Wollaston as applied to the reference star, then cut out into strips for sorting and deduping like a spreadsheet operation. There are even more necessary steps here well documented in her notebooks. And to my mind, one of the best ways we have to constellate all of this data and metadata is to pick up on Caroline's use of the word collecting here that you can see, and recall Hoskins' framing of the Herschels as natural historians of the sky. But to do that with a twist, by considering how much data management and, dare I say, paperwork goes into making any natural history collection usable for analysis. Such a digital edition could represent the years that Caroline spent preparing, recording, correcting, collating, deduping, and cleaning their massive data for analysis, publication, and use, not least of all, as the intellectual down payment for the foundation of the RAS. As Simon Schaefer and William J. Ashworth remind us, John Herschel saw astronomy as a business and its accumulated knowledge as a form of wealth equal to any in the vaults of London's banks. The wide range of the applications of creatively bringing the Herschels back to life from the minute particulars of the records they left behind have already been demonstrated by a number of scholars, such as the musicologist on this panel, Sarah Waltz, and as well by Steinecke, who has rediscovered dozens of their objects. Just as the Herschels mined their own data sets to produce new discoveries, and just as modern astronomers fostered the artificial intelligence subdiscipline of knowledge discovery in a similar but bigger data context, so might we take a page from these scholars' books and reconstruct the archival work that Caroline spent much of her life performing, and within which there are not only new rediscoveries to be had, but also more than a few lessons to be learned about knowledge work in the age of big data. Thank you.
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you, John. So I'll just take we have about 5 minutes before our scheduled break. I'll take the liberty of asking a quick question while we wait for, you're welcome to ask questions on the Q&A app. How can folks find the Stellarium plugin? Is there a link or something you can post in the chat?
Yeah, I'll pull it up.
Thank you.
And it works with, you can get all of it. The code and everything. So first, my email, because it's a good bet that you'll have trouble installing it. It's tricky, which is why we made those videos. But I'll post the link to the whole code base.
Thank you. All right, a few minutes. Again, please feel free if you have questions to type them into the Q&A app.
Might I ask a question, Steve?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I'm wondering, John, if you look at William and Carolyn's contribution, as has traditionally been done, and when I look through the archives of both of them, it seems like Carolyn never has any ideas on the astronomy. William is the idea man, and then Carolyn is vital in carrying out, acquiring the data that is needed, especially for the catalogs. Could you comment on that a bit? Does that matter in this industrial way you're looking at things?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate characterization. One of the so to sort of explain like why this perspective is interesting to me. Like there's a lot of it actually sort of runs in parallel to what Sarah just argued. So there's a tendency in scholarship on Caroline Herschel to say her musical career was taken away from her, right? And her comet sweeping and discovery career, like, were taken away from her. And like, I don't want to downplay that, but an overemphasis on it can ignore what her truly brilliant, right, achievement was, which is, as you're saying, this massive, utterly flawless, like, data gathering and processing and extraction, right? Because the large scale data transformations that she's able to do produce new kinds of knowledge out of the raw data that they had. And I think that when you look at it from that perspective, then you start to regret a little bit that above all, and this is why the Wordsworth comparison is so powerful to me, you begin to regret that William got married. Because they could have gotten to 100%. And I'll go out on a limb. Okay, I think that I'll go out on a limb, and I think he got bored because of what he'd turned observation into. Right. So observation is typically seen in astronomy as sort of that, you know, creative thing that like the privileged scientist does back in the old days. Right. But they're at a moment where it seems like they've turned it into something else, right? They've almost made this into positional astronomy. And if you've seen photographs of those observatories, you'll have a person on a couch with a giant telescope coming down to their eye, and that person's not allowed to touch anything. There's someone else by the clock and someone else by the book, right? So they even subdivide all of these roles. So that sort of mechanical nature of it, I think, must have driven him slightly crazy, which is why he, you know, tracked and followed these objects. Obviously, doing so allows you to have greater detail on the things that you see, right? But there is a trade-off there. Yeah,
but he was doing a lot of other kinds of astronomy.
Yes,
you know, looking at planets and comets and the sun in detail. There was just one guy one of his smaller telescopes, which were more suited for that. But I like what you're saying. And the other thing is, in today's science, you might say, it's the guy that is the brilliant programmer, data analyst working with the idea guy that gets the Nobel Prize. But the data guy does not, and very, very unfairly, perhaps.
You're following me entirely. Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, that brings us to the beginning of our 10-minute break. Thank you, Woody. Thanks, John. I just want to again give everyone's attention to the Q&As. There are some that have been posted and about Sarah's talk. She's actually answering those. And keep posting those, and the panelists can answer, and then you can click over to the answered ones and see those as well. So that'll be available through the entire thing. But at this point, we'll take a 10-minute break, and we will be back for our next talk at well, it's 2 o'clock my time, whatever our schedule says. Thank you.
Are we allowed to respond to people during the break?
I don't think we can assume the audience is there, but maybe they are. There's still 107 participants.
Yeah.
I wanted to say one last slightly irreverent thing, that one of Michael Hoskins' great lines was that once Herschel got married, he found there was something else to do at night.
That is very you see a really interesting parallel between those two sibling pairs that I'm holding up, where you get like, it was actually I don't think people are wrong to see a certain amount of tension between Caroline and William when he gets married, but they tend to put it down to her sort of displacement from like head of the household, and I think that's correct too. But I tend to view it more in terms of like they undertook this like ridiculously risky endeavor, and threw all of their time into it, and then as soon as it becomes successful, right? He goes and like gets a personal life, and that was sort of contrary to this to the form of life that they'd sort of undertaken together, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you get a similar thing with the Wordsworths, the same sort of tension from the brother getting married. Although for Dorothy Wordsworth, it turns out it's a bit more tragic.
Yeah. No, David Dvorkin is pointing out, looking
that's
at
why I wanted to stay on. Yeah, thank you.
David Dvorkin is pointing out that Carolyn did get the RAS prize for one of her massive programming, we might say today, in terms of putting a catalog in an entirely different order than it was before, which was quite amazing at that time. She couldn't even be a member of the society, and yet she got their gold medal.
And didn't she get it alongside
Mary Somerville?
Mary Somerville, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, what I'd say to that, David, if you've read the speech that's given at the awarding of that medal, that's a really important nodal point for a lot of scholarship on Caroline that tries to talk about like the gender division of labor in the observatory. Mm-hmm. They make her into sort of this, William. They characterize William's work as like being the ideas guy, right? Being creative, and her virtues, right? So his virtue is genius, and her virtue is diligence, right? That she sticks with it, and that she's meticulous, right? And so you can see them trying to sort them in there, but like that wedge is really, really hard to maintain once you see that like a lot of William's genius insights come from the ability to use the data that she processed.
And you didn't ever explicitly say it, but the accuracy with which she copied things and made these observations and recorded things the next morning based on only, quickly scribbled things the night before. It's just amazing.
And there's enough scraps of paper kicking around that you could really go from item A to item B to, deep sky reproductions of these phenomena that it's the perfect use case for like a linked data archive, I think.
Yeah. It's very frustrating from a historian's point of view, though, sometimes that you find that there are 3 copies of something. Carolyn's made them all, you can tell by her hand, of course, but they're not dated as to which is the first and which is the second, nor is there a reason given often as to why the copy was made, and it can get very confusing.
It is, and I think there's a lot more in there. And sometimes you'll have William's notes on top of her notes because he's stepped back in to check or something or edit.
Yeah, right.
And sometimes she'll even note which it is, but not all the time. And one of Steineke's moments where he calls this out is he notes in some really great moments that like this is William's line and this is Caroline's line.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could decompose it in a very interesting way.
Shall I go ahead and try to set up screen sharing?
Absolutely.
So I need John to surrender. Thanks.
There we go.
Just a quick test. Can you hear that? Did you hear that?
I can hear that, David. Did you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
That just a test. All right.
Oh, you get the award for the best color coordinated title slide,
Oh,
matching his coat with a cello. That's great. Or is that a cello?
oh, it's supposed to be a viola, of course, but
It's a close-up of a viola, yeah. I've never seen a viola that close before.
oh, they're all patterns of each other, right? I mean.
David, I do see your whole screen, and you can share just the application if you want.
Right. I thought I would do it this way and then just escape to go to the video.
Yeah, that works.
We'll just steal some of your software here.
But I don't see you know, before is it when we turn it back on, will I see the insert from the Zoom? Because I don't see that right now. I just see my shared screen.
Are you still puzzled? We should ask Patrick here.
Yeah, so you hear me fine, right? I don't see any of the video insets from the Zoom. I just see the kind of toolbar for Zoom plus my own.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that the way it goes? Okay, well, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, that's correct.
I won't know if I suddenly look really stupid, but that's okay.
Are your videos embedded within the PowerPoint?
No, they aren't. Oh, no, they
Okay.
aren't.
All right. So whenever you want to show a video, you'll have to minimize the PowerPoint,
Yeah.
and then you can run the video.
Yeah, that was my plan.
Great.
Okay, are we ready to start? Is it time?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for returning. I would like to introduce Dr. David Kerner. He is Emeritus Associate Professor of Astronomy and Planetary Science at Northern Arizona University. His work is focused on star and planet formation, astrobiology, and indigenous astronomy at Caltech, JPL, University of Pennsylvania, and Northern Arizona. Dr. Kerner is also an accomplished musician and learned of Herschel's 3 unpublished viola concertos while completing the MM degree in instrumental performance at NAU. So thank you, Dr. Kerner.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to be at this wonderful session. It's so exciting to hear so much about a topic where little has come forward. I'm going to talk pretty exclusively about the background for the viola concertos. It was while working on my master's degree in viola performance late in life, moonlighting, that I was surprised to discover Herschel had written 3 viola concertos. I was taking a lit class and I was in search of viola concertos written in the 18th century because there are precious few of them. And I wanted to know if there were any undiscovered ones, because violists pretty much have to play the same 3 or 4 all the time. And I wanted something different. And looking through a catalog, I was astonished to discover that William Herschel's name was there for 3 viola concertos. So I quickly rooted around to find out where I could get my hands on these. Now, just as a little background, the viola concertos in the 18th century were confined to these few examples. In the Baroque period, Bach, of course, wrote his famous Brandenburg Concerto No. 6 for 2 violas. And Telemann wrote a Baroque viola concerto that's pretty much the standard that every young viola player has to learn. And then as styles began to change, the viola became a little more prominent. However, for most of that time in the 18th century, the viola was never a solo instrument. Solos in that range were more often done by viola d'amore or viola da gamba, and not by the viola per se. Later in the century, there were several classical concertos written, Stamitz, Hofmeister, Benda, and these are kind of the standard classical repertoire for violists, and that's about it. And it's why I was looking for something else. In particular, viola was not coming to the fore in Italy or in England during this time, but it was beginning to rise up as a solo instrument in Germany. And that's probably why Herschel wrote viola concertos. Now, when I went and tried to figure out where these viola concertos were, I immediately looked at all the music publishing houses and found absolutely nothing because they are not published. And I thought, oh, that's why I haven't heard of them. And I finally found out that they are in manuscript form at the Berkeley Library. This particular folio that Berkeley owns was acquired in the 50s from the estate of Herschel's descendants. And it's a fascinating folio. As far as I know, none of it is officially published yet. And boy, wouldn't this be a good year for that to change. In that folio, there are 8 concertos. 3 of them are for viola, 2 for oboe, and 3 for violin as well. The earliest viola concertos dated are in 1759, so that puts them at the period where Herschel's still very young and just before Jacob leaves. And so in the period of writing the concertos, we don't have his correspondence to his brother. And so almost all the information we have is kind of internal to the musicology of the works themselves. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit. In the 50s, after Berkeley made the acquisition, there was an attempt to bring them forward at a meeting of the Astronomical Society of the Pacific. The librarian then, musicologist Vincent Duckles, officiated and wrote an article for ASP on the viola concertos. The F major concerto was premiered by the Griller Quartet at that time. And Duckles wrote a bit of analysis, and then it sort of went nowhere after that. There were some student works. There was a dissertation on the Maidstone D minor concerto and a very good essay that you can fish out of a New York library on the London F major concerto. Somewhat later, there was a performance of the F major concerto at an International Viola Congress. And still today, there aren't any official recordings, but there are YouTube recordings now coming available. But there are also no widely available scores. And I think this is a mistake because the concertos merit accessibility by young violists and incorporation into the standard literature of viola. So that's what I would like to champion. Now, just as a background, and this has a lot of overlap with Woody's talk, so I won't dwell on it, but here are some centers of music in Germany and where viola began to be used as a solo instrument. Mannheim, Hanover, Berlin, Hamburg. So Telemann was in Hamburg early on, where that first Baroque viola concerto was written. But what's really important is this connection between Berlin and Hanover, because it was in Berlin at Frederick the Great's court where there seemed to have been a lot more innovations in using viola as a solo instrument. All these other bullets here are kind of general background, which Woody's covered quite well. So I think to understand this, one needs to look a little bit into the background of music at the court of Frederick the Great. I highly recommend a very accessible, popular book that talks about the transition of music through the court of Frederick the Great, including the big drama of where Johann Sebastian Bach went to visit his son at the court of Frederick the Great, and they had this sort of duel about these old contrapuntal styles versus the new styles. This book, Evening in the Palace of Reason, is a really fun and accessible book. It's not necessarily a big scholarly tool, but the thing I'd like to recommend about it is it has a very good accounting of the relation between Frederick and his mother, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. And notice the of Hanover part, because that's where Herschel was reared. And the main point that you find in that account is that Sophia was the really fount of inspiration for Frederick's interest in music. So Frederick's father was a bit of a Philistine, to put it mildly. And when Frederick took over the court in 1840, he brought all his interests in art and literature and philosophy to that court where it wasn't before. And a lot of that thrived because of the influence of his mother, who was in Hanover. And so this strengthens the idea that there must have been a lot of cross-fertilization between what was going on in Berlin and what was going on in the court life in Hanover, where Herschel's father was trying to prime him through the regimental band to eventually become a musician, which of course he did not, but his brother did. Now, there were amazing musicians brought to Frederick's court, and that had a big influence on viola playing and on violin playing. One of the most important, I think, for Herschel, as we'll see a little bit later, was Franz Benda. He goes to Berlin in 1740. Interesting to note that Isaac Herschel actually had studied music in Berlin prior to the accession of Frederick the Great, but it was much too martial for him in the regimental bands there. I mean, he still was in a band in Hanover, but being closer to the center of Prussian government made it even more not to his liking. He was more of a creative soul. Benda comes, and there are several Bendas that then come later with him, one of whom writes a viola concerto that's a staple in the literature much later in the 18th century. But Benda also wrote a lot of studies for violin, and these clearly influenced Herschel if you just do a comparison study of the scores. I was excited to find out from Sarah and Woody that is discussed in the correspondences between William and his brother. So that confirms that. So we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Other important musicians at Frederick's court especially include C.P.E. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach's son, who composed and led music in Berlin. And these other composers, Georg Benda and Graun and Grau, were important to championing the solo role for viola. Now, when we look at this, and Sarah's already mentioned this, Empfindsamkeit was an influence, a German influence in the style of music, stylistic changes moving from the Baroque period. It included elements like sudden dynamic changes, going suddenly from piano to forte, for example, and back, dotted rhythms, and a little bit daring harmonic structure. And we see this in both the Maidstone and London viola concertos, and especially in the second movement of Herschel's D minor viola concerto. Here's an excerpt from it, and what I'd like to point out to you is these little letters of dynamic indications. For one, look how they radically change abruptly. We're mezzo piano, suddenly forte, piano, forte, double piano, etc. This is characteristic of this Empfindsamkeit style. It was not popular in England, so we have to attribute this kind of writing to the culture in Germany. And one other clue is that Herschel wrote 24 violin caprices, and these are in that same folio. I was astonished to find this out because as a violinist, the earliest caprices I thought of usually were just Paganini's, which weren't written until 1817. And so what in the world was Herschel doing writing 24 violin caprices around about 1760? That is more than 50 years earlier. So I started looking into them, and the clearest counterpart were violin caprices of Franz Benda. Those caprices have similar styles, they have similar key relations and similar virtuosic difficulties to explore in the violin. And I should add that these are hard. Herschel's are hard. So he must have been a pretty darn good violinist to be able to be working on those. And there are a couple of examples in Herschel's caprices that look like adaptations of Benda's caprices. In particular, the first and sixth caprice appear to be related to Benda's later caprice. So here's in Herschel's hand, and as Sarah remarked earlier, what a great writing style. And of course, he did make his first living in England as a music copyist. And so there's just this beautiful manuscript writing, you can just read it directly. But look at this is in A minor, and it starts off with this broken string configuration and some bowings. This is just a catalog entry from a Benda caprice. It's pretty much the same notes, except it's in the major key. Another thing that happened is later in Benda's caprice, he changes abruptly to another technical difficulty in which he skips strings, big skips, and so it's a bowing exercise. Herschel doesn't do that in his first caprice, but he does it in a sixth caprice. So he writes a whole separate caprice on that technical difficulty. And so here's just another example of the cross-fertilization between musicians in Berlin and Herschel's writing. Now, this reproduces a lot of things that Woody covered in much better detail, but I just kind of wanted to point out on here the locations of writing for the viola concertos, in particular, 2 of the 3 that are the most complete. One is, and they're both dated 1759, and the D minor is labeled Maidstone, and the F major is labeled London. And so here's the relationship between those kind of centers. And chronologically, it's this period here. Herschel is here in the period of 1755 to 1757. He's quite young. Jacob is still with him and then leaves, after which he goes up to here. But the viola concertos belong to that time period in his life where he has more recently emigrated from North Germany. And so it's later that his style changes, as was documented in the earlier talks. So let's talk a little bit, as has already been briefly mentioned, about him making it in London. He starts as a music copyist. He's a very good copyist, judging by the appearance of his scores. He does try to make it as a concert performer and get out of just having to copy music. Composers at that time who were string players pretty much composed for their own performing life, as Sarah sort of alluded to, and Herschel was not an exception. So he would have written the caprices, the viola concertos, and a set of sonatas, by the way, which are also not widely known and are in that same folio. Here's a listing from newspaper ads that Herschel gave a violin concert with, quote, also viola in the 1760 season. And this is, of course, well before viola was used as a solo instrument in England or at all, anywhere. So it's kind of sticks out as very unusual. It wasn't a mode of playing that was popular. And so one wonders whether Herschel was trying to distinguish himself by doing something different and playing viola. If so, it apparently didn't work too much. Here's a quote that Sarah already posted, where he later said, "London was so overstocked with musicians that we had but little chance of great success." Now, there may have been a musical element as well. Vincent Duckles writes about the 2 major concertos that they show the clearest examples of Empfindsamkeit, the style of sensibility. And of course, it was supposed to provoke the emotions. He says, in these 2 concertos, we can see the composer extending himself to the utmost, trying every trick at his command. You can sort of imagine the starving artist trying as hard as possible to make his way and doing everything he can. Duckles speculated that these North German qualities clashed with English taste. And he says, possibly they considered it too intense and personal. At any rate, 2 years later, he was writing in a completely different style, a style more fashionable and more pleasing, but perhaps less suited to his particular gifts. There were all kinds of influences on Herschel at that time. We saw in Sarah's wonderful graph about this being such a transitional time in musical styles. I simply want to add here that Herschel's F major concerto is in the concerto grosso style. Here's the first page of the manuscript, and what that means is he has the viola principal part here, but there are also solo parts for violin and cello, and then what's called a ripieno part below. And they have outlined their own solo parts later on in the piece, so it's a concerto grosso style. What about that other concerto? It's a very early work. It looks to be very much in the Baroque style. And it starts out very contrapuntally, and I just kind of label it here. You have kind of a fugue. Here's the first statement. Here's a second statement. Here's the third statement. They all come in. And it seems to be in a much earlier style. All right. So what I'd like to do at this point, I've recorded some of the D minor concerto. I don't think we have time for it all, but I would like to just start to run it for you. And when we run out of time, I'll stop it and perhaps answer questions. But I'd like you to note, I think we will get into the second movement. And in the second movement, the slow movement is where you especially can notice Empfindsamkeit styles. So without further ado, let me just start it. this to the start of the second movement because of the Empfindsamkeit, and I'm running out of time. I'm running out of time, so I thought I will.
I think we need to stop there, and everyone's going to hate me for that.
No, that's it.
But I am so happy that we have this. Okay.
Sorry, that was the beginning of the third movement. If anyone.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll try to make an opportunity for it all to be heard, because that is really valuable.
Thank you.
And I think, we all have comments and questions, and I certainly found this very valuable for my own personal work. So I think it would be great if people just went ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and then we will try to answer them, in text as we go. And then when we have time afterwards, we will go ahead and vocalize some of them. And if you could stop, yes, there you go. It is time for Cliff Cunningham's paper. And now it's available for you to share your screen, Cliff, when you're ready. Clifford J. Cunningham's PhD in history of astronomy dealt largely with William Herschel and the asteroids. He is research fellow at the University of Southern Queensland in Australia. He has written or edited 15 books on history of astronomy. Is a series editor of Springer's historical and cultural astronomy books, and associate editor of the Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage. Asteroid 4276 was named Clifford in his honor in 1990. His discoveries in poetry include showing that Manilius introduced the 6 magnitude system and a description of the aurora borealis in Milton's Paradise Lost. So welcome, Cliff.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you can't see me, but as long as you can see my slides and hear me, we're all fine.
I don't see them yet.
Or you don't see the slide yet?
No.
Okay. Share screen.
And then there's a little confirm button. There we are.
Okay, very good. We're all set now?
Yeah, great.
Okay, perfect. So we don't usually think of William Herschel in connection with poetry, but there are quite a few connections, remarkably enough. While he never wrote a poem, he actually composed an oratorio based on Milton's Paradise Lost, the greatest epic poem in English history. And we heard earlier that was an unfinished work. I want to discuss his relationship to Charles Burney Sr., who we also heard mentioned earlier. They cooperated in the composition of a didactic poem on astronomy in the late 1700s. But as time went on, tastes in poetry changed. And even Shelley thought that all didactic poetry was an abhorrence. So in the very early 19th century, Burney actually burnt his entire manuscript. Most unfortunate indeed. There is one fragment remaining of a first draft of his poem, which I will show a little bit later. But before I go on with that, I want to mention more about Burney and Herschel. They were very close friends, perhaps even best friends. And they had a major interaction with regard to asteroid research, which is the subject of 7 of those books out of my 15. And Herschel was studying Ceres and Pallas, the first 2 objects that had been discovered between Mars and Jupiter. And he was preparing to give a paper at the Royal Society. It was going to be read a week hence. So he didn't know what to call them. So he actually went to Burney Sr., knocked on his door, and said, I need a word to describe these 2 objects. So Burney Sr. immediately wrote a letter to his son, who was an expert in Greek. And he suggested that something perhaps starting with the word aster would be appropriate. And within a few hours, Charles Burney Jr. created the word asteroid. And finding out that he actually did that was one of my big discoveries when I was working on my PhD at the University of Southern Queensland. So Charles Burney Sr. continued to collaborate with Herschel as the decades wore on. They were very close friends and met many times. As a result, there are very few letters between them. Since they were meeting in person, they didn't write letters to one another. But I want to go back and see what went on prior with regard to didactic poetry on astronomy. 13 centuries before Burney, Martianus Capella wrote a didactic allegory using allusive verse. The title gives no indication that it's about astronomy, but in fact it is. And he wrote in there that Venus and Mercury both circle the sun. Now, Copernicus was well aware of this work and he praised it. And it was certainly an inspiration for him when he was developing the heliocentric theory of the universe. 6 centuries before Burney, Bernardus Sylvestris wrote Cosmographia, and that included a catalog of the stars and planets, among many other things. And this was an age when poetry was fully appreciated. And in fact, Sylvestris was able to read his entire astronomical poem in person to the Pope, Eugenius III, in 1148. 3 centuries before Burney, Lorenzo Bonacontri used the very same approach as Burney did. Both tried to incorporate the latest critical thinking about the cosmos. Bonancontri's poem was published in 1472, Of the Natural and Divine Things, or Of the Celestial Things. And I find it very interesting that even though 3 centuries separated them, their modus operandi was identical. They were not just writing poetry for the sake of beautiful words, but they were actually trying to incorporate the modern understanding of the cosmos in their work. And a close contemporary of Bonacontri was Giovanni Pantano. And he wrote what is the most famous such didactic poem on astronomy ever written. He started and primarily finished it in the 1470s, but didn't complete it until just before his death. And it was called Urania. It was published just after his death in 1505. So he writes there, which fires shine in the firmament, which stars move the silent sky, with which stars the zodiac glitters, and how the planets follow their trajectories. Such things tell me, O divine muse, Urania. And he got the inspiration from this from his own writing and reading, and the Astronomica of Manilius was a very important classical precedent for him. And in fact, as I showed in a recent paper published in the Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage, it is from that work that the magnitude system derives. It was long thought to be from Hipparchus, but the 6 magnitude system first appears in a text that is still extant, at least, in Manilius. And we have absolutely no definitive evidence that the 6 magnitude system was developed prior to that. So as you see in this engraving, the heavens inspired both poets and astronomers for centuries. And Burney followed Pontano in evoking Urania as the one who will tell of the heavens. So this is the extract from the poem by Burney, the only extract that still exists. It was dated just last year by Elaine Bander to the year 1789. So this was more than 20 full years during this 20 full year period that he worked with Herschel on it, and eventually burning the manuscript in the early 1800s. And you see in the last line of this poetic extract, he invokes the astronomic muse, who of course is Urania. And Urania has been associated with astronomy for a very long time indeed. The first depiction you see there on the lower right is Urania with the celestial sphere from 300 BCE in Macedonia. So it's been at least 2,300 years that Urania has been the muse of astronomy. And even here in this didactic poem that Burney was writing, which was based on real astronomy, not any form of astrology or hearkening back to classical mythology, he still was tied to the concept of the astronomic muse. The structure of Burney's poem is something we do know, even though the poem no longer exists. It was, in fact, history of astronomy. He was describing very carefully in 11 stanzas how astronomy developed from earliest times to the later 18th century. But he saved the best to last. Number 12 was Herschel's discoveries. In September of 1797, he wrote that Herschel was reading his poem and admitted that he had never been fond of poetry. So Herschel himself thought poetry only consisted of the arrangement of fine words without meaning. But when it contained science and information such as mine, he liked it very well. And he found that quite encouraging, even though he was much older than someone who would have his head turned by such flattery. And in January 1798, to start off the new year, he wrote, "Thus far I have advanced and have an idea of 2 books more on the progress of astronomy from the middle of the present century to the time of Herschel, and the next to last book I shall devote to Herschel and his discoveries." So we can see that the last 2 stanzas, 11 and 12, actually dated from this time. So he was actively working with and interviewing Herschel during the 1798, 1799, 1800 period. And this is a letter to his daughter. I won't read the whole thing, but the point is that he actually read to Herschel the first 5 books of his poem before Herschel stopped him with a potential correction. And you can read the details of the correction there. And at the bottom, Burney was quite pleased with himself. That was all I had to correct of doctrine in the first 5 books. And he, meaning Herschel, was so humble as to confess that I know more of the history of astronomy than he did, and had surprised him with the massive information I had got. Now, how readable that poem actually was is, of course, something we will never know. Didactic poetry can, of course, be very tedious, or in the hands of a true expert master, such as we had in ancient times, it could be something that would live for millennia. But in this case, we will never know how good it was. And the most interesting interaction of all occurred in 1799 at Windsor Castle, when Herschel and Burney and King George III all had a conversation. So the first question His Majesty asked me was, how does astronomy go on? And Burney responded, Dr. Herschel will better inform your Majesty than I can. It is all finished, except for the last book. The king then looked at Herschel, who replied, it is very capital work, sir. Whatever you write, I am sure will be entertaining, replied the king. So imagine that scene in Windsor Castle, quite extraordinary. The interaction of astronomy and poetry and royalty, a very rare event indeed. So in the second part of my talk here, I want to discuss how Herschel's work influenced poets, and of course, William Wordsworth being the most famous one of all. In 1815, he wrote a poem, Stargazers, which talked about a telescope upon its frame and pointed to the sky. And this is certainly a direct reference to Herschel's own telescope, which, as you see, had a frame all around it to support it. And the next one I'm going to put out here for anyone expert listening, is this the first recorded instance of a mountaintop observation? It was in the poem, The Thorn, written in 1789 by Wordsworth. He said, for one day with my telescope, to view the ocean wide and bright, I climbed the mountain's height. Now, this is obviously not an astronomical observation, but still, it is an observation with a telescope on a mountaintop. And as we all know, telescopes were not placed on mountains back then. That didn't develop until much later in the 1800s. So I'm wondering if this is in fact the first suggestion that observing with a telescope on the top of a mountain was a good idea. Just as one other example of how Herschel's research influenced poets, we'll look at William Blake. And he wrote, when the stars threw down their spears and waters heaven with their tears. The tears he's referring to here are the shining fluids that Herschel wrote of in his discussion of nebula in his Philtrans paper published in 1791. Now, most importantly, Herschel's work in the infrared really influenced a lot of philosophy and poetry after his time. Now, we normally think of Shelley writing Prometheus Unbound as a very romantic work, since he was the ultimate romantic poet in England. But he actually included a lot of interesting information about what was going on. And we'll move to Coleridge. In May of 1801, Coleridge asked the chemist Humphrey Davy, who also wrote poetry, to explain whether Herschel's thermometric spectrum will lead to any revolution in chemical philosophy. And Coleridge, who we think of as primarily a poet, actually started doing experiments in physics and optics. He acquired prisms and began conducting very important researches and studies with them. But he pursued this so relentlessly, he lost sleep and became feverish. Wordsworth personally stepped in and confiscated the prisms to save his friend's sanity, if not his very life. It's quite extraordinary.
5 minutes, Cliff.
Yeah. Coleridge had some very definitive views on religion, very complicated to go into, which I don't have time here, but he actually incorporated his views of Christianity in a style expressed in terms of Herschel's infrared. And he wrote in 1810, for example, the light of religion is not that of the moon, light without heat, but neither is it warmth, that of the stove, warmth without light. And that is very clearly influenced by Herschel's discovery of infrared. Now, he also took the concept of forms and overlaid it onto Herschel's discoveries. It was the Herschelian forms and schemes of motion of the stars and planets, which excited Coleridge, based on his 1806 paper. Now, for a lot of things, we historians of science have to infer what the sources were for a particular poet or philosopher. In this case, Coleridge gives it to us on a silver platter. You perhaps remember the suggestion of Herschel from which I have taken my metaphor, namely the possibility that there may be bodies in the universe that singly form a system to balance other systems. So in this way, Coleridge tried to construct a system that would unify intellect and faith. And there's an interesting link between Pontano and Coleridge. Centuries earlier, Pontano discerned the very same thing as Coleridge in his explanation of poetic choices. Again, using the same phrase, motion of the stars. We have to look at the motion of the stars and how it excites the humors and seeds by which these things called phantasms are visible. The poet's choice of judgment is the key thing here. Edgar Allan Poe wrote many famous poems and some that were not so famous. One was published in 1827, Spirits of the Dead. And here he incorporated infrared. But their red orbs without beam to thy weariness shall seem as a burning and a fever. And it was known that red rays were accompanied by more heat than those of any other color. Without beam clearly signifies the invisible rays of infrared. And the fact that the red orbs shall seem as a burning and a fever is scientifically accurate, as well as poetically apt in a description of the infrared. And finally, I'll mention a very interesting link between Erasmus Darwin, Herschel, and Poe. William Herschel's grandfather learned gardening in the Elector's Gardens at Dresden. And in 1709, William wrote, "The heavens are seen to resemble a luxuriant garden." Now, Poe wrote a poem called The Landscape Garden, which he later expanded into the domain of Arnhem. It was inspired by Herschel and the cosmological theories in the Botanic Garden of Erasmus Darwin. The protagonist of Arnhem is an advocate of philosophies of progress. He realizes the poetic sentiment in man would best be fulfilled by becoming a landscape artist. So in summary, Herschel himself had little use for poetry with the exception of the didactic form. He worked closely with Charles Burney in the composition of a major poem about the history of astronomy. Due to Herschel's scientific discoveries, especially infrared, Coleridge came to regard astronomy in theological terms. Poetry inspired William to write music, and his discoveries in turn inspired poets. Now, even though William wrote no poetry, his son John did. "To thee, fair science, long and early loved, hath been of old my open homage paid. Not false nor recreant have I ever proved, nor grudged the gift upon thy altar laid." 1857. And just in memoriam, here I am with Dr. Hoskin, who we all greatly revere and honor today as well as William Herschel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cliff. That was just a jam-packed paper for me. There is so much in there. And I really appreciated everything in it. Again, we are best suited to go on to the next paper, but please do include your comments in the chat and in the Q&A, and I'll be able to moderate them after the last paper. So at this point, we can stop sharing, and Stephen can get his slides up.
Looks like I still need Cliff to.
Yeah. Cliff, can you go down and hit share screen and stop sharing?
Share. Let's see. Trying to see. Oh, there we go. Stop share. Sorry. There we go.
No problem.
Got it.
Everybody's Zoom instances are set up differently. So
yes.
Okay, so now we see your slides, Stephen. Thanks very much. Stephen Case is an author and historian of astronomy, focusing on John Herschel and 19th century science. In 2018, he published Making Stars Physical, The Astronomy of Sir John Herschel. He teaches at Olivet Nazarene University in Kankakee, Illinois, and is currently working on 2 further books, The first is tentatively titled John Herschel and the Reform of Science for University of Pittsburgh Press and focuses on Herschel's early career. The second, co-edited with Lucas Verburgt, is the Cambridge Companion to John Herschel for Cambridge University Press. So thank you very much, Steve.
All right. Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Sarah?
I can, yes.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for everyone who has stuck around and to hear a little bit of an epilogue to this session so far. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about the way that John Herschel really extended and established what we could call the Sidereal Revolution begun by William and Caroline. And I also want to give an example, so I'll end with sort of an anecdote of Herschel, the Herschelian enduring legacy in the solar system today, which, because we've heard now a couple times that William actually did not enjoy poetry, he might himself feel a little bit ambivalent about. So the work of William and Caroline Herschel, as we've seen, was unique for its time. Not only was no one observing the things that they were observing in the skies, no one else even had the instrumentation to see them if they had chosen to. Yet though Caroline and William's work brought the sidereal universe, double stars and nebulae in particular, into the popular imagination and presented these objects to a wider audience, the brother-sister team took no apprentices, trained no students, and established no school. Even the catalogs created of the objects William observed were not organized to make them very useful for other observers. This, along with the hold that William kept on his techniques for casting and polishing his mirrors, meant that Herschelian astronomy could have ended with him. Now, fortunately, in 1792, at the age of 53, William Herschel had a son. And fortunately for the Sidereal Revolution that William and Caroline initiated, William's son, John Herschel, would dedicate much of his life to establishing and extending that revolution. And I should note, because it's coming up, Monday, March the 7th, is the date that John Herschel was born. And this Monday would have been 230 years from his birth. So what I want to do with the time remaining in our session is to briefly summarize John Herschel's career in astronomy to show how it was motivated by the goal of making William's work more useful and accessible to a wide range of observers. As I've outlined in much more detail in my research, John Herschel's work moved William's observations into the mainstream of astronomical practice and transformed speculation regarding the sidereal heavens into standardized systems of data. John did this by synthesizing the observational method of his father with the careful data processing method of his aunt, Caroline. Now, a complete biographical sketch of Herschel is beyond the scope of this talk. Suffice to say that John was possibly more celebrated during his lifetime than William. A member and ultimately a vice president of the Royal Society, a founder of the Royal Astronomical Society, knighted for his contributions to science, which included astronomy, but also chemistry and optics. John's popular books on astronomy and science made him a household name, and his 4-year excursion to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to extend his father's work to the entire heavens made him a scientific hero. Upon his return, he was given a hereditary title by Queen Victoria and seen as the leading statesman of science of his era. To use a modern analogy, he became the Carl Sagan of the Victorian age. One modern historian has gone so far as to say that being scientific in the mid-1800s simply meant to be as much like John Herschel as possible. Others have called him the most important natural philosopher in England between Newton and Darwin, and fittingly, he's buried in Westminster Abbey between them. Now, John's early life and career were shaped in important ways by William Herschel's work, but not necessarily in the ways that William might have hoped. William recognized that his own mathematical aptitude was not what he would have liked. This kept him, he felt, from being viewed as a natural philosopher rather than simply as a skilled instrument maker. Likely in response to this, William took an active role in John's mathematical education and ensured that John was tutored in the mathematics of the continent, Lagrange and Laplace, before setting foot at Cambridge. This was so effective that when John arrived at Cambridge for the university education his father had never received, John was disappointed with and over-prepared for the mathematics of the academy. William, it turned out, was not alone in being on the back foot mathematically. Much of English mathematics was woefully behind development of European mathematical analysis. Math instruction at Cambridge was outdated, and John's first important publications were not astronomical, but mathematical, written alongside his friend Charles Babbage with a zeal to bring French analysis to England, at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. John's first scholarly forays were as a mathematician. It was on the strength of this work that he was elected to the Royal Society, and it meant, going forward, that he had mathematical tools at his disposal beyond those of his father. Now, after Cambridge, John showed no interest to pursue astronomical work. William urged him toward a career in the church, but John decided on law and then spent his time in London attending chemistry and mineralogy lectures. After a brief return to Cambridge as a tutor, John finally acquiesced to take on his father's mantle. William was eager to instruct John in his methods of sweeping, but John had no intention of making observing at Slough his full-time occupation. On top of optical and chemical experiments, John embarked on a program of double star observations with the London surgeon James South. Along with Charles Babbage, he also participated in the forming of the Astronomical Society to reform astronomy, against the objections of Joseph Banks, the autocratic president of the Royal Society. Now, these first steps already show an important evolution from his father's work. In addition to his mathematical aptitude, John began his observing career in a community of observers, establishing standards and uniform practices, something that would remain central to how he ultimately extended his father's work. With John's double star catalogs, first published in 1824, with eventually 4 more published by the time of his departure for the Cape of Good Hope, we can see the important continuity and development of William's work through John's. Observing double stars was outside standard astronomical practice, yet these targets offered the chance to search for stellar parallax with line of sight doubles, or confirm the extension of Newtonian gravity beyond the solar system for binary stars. William's double star catalogs had begun with the search for parallax. However, his realization that some double stars were gravitationally bound actually undermined this project by introducing a new class of celestial objects. After William's discovery of binary stars, if an observer found a double star, there was no way to know whether it was a good candidate for parallax or if any apparent motion was the result of mutual gravitation. John Herschel then began his double star catalogs not to discover more, but to revisit his father's in order to solve this problem. By systematically measuring positions using a micrometer in South 7-foot equatorial, he reported whether any change in relative position of component stars had taken place. In other words, John's first catalog served to make his father's earlier observations useful for other observers. Whereas William swept the sky for discoveries and used what he found as a basis for his natural history of the heavens, John worked to establish empirical baselines against which future observations could be compared. The results of his double star work were mathematical methods for calculating double star orbits and masses, something William was unable to do with his own data. Now, where John Herschel's work is usually seen as having the greatest continuity with his father's work is on the nebulae. John did not embark on the work of revisiting his father's nebula catalogs until after William's death in 1822, which occurred when John was away from home traveling in the Netherlands. It's unlikely this work would have happened at all without the urging of Caroline Herschel, living on in Hanover. Whereas William's original nebula catalogs were organized in order of discovery and minimally useful for guiding other observers back to these objects in the sky, for several years, Caroline had been re-editing, reorganizing, and reducing William's data into a new catalog organized by right ascension. When John urged her to publish it, she refused. She meant it as a resource for John, so he could use his father's 20-foot reflector to revisit and complete William's surveys. As with his work on double stars, John recognized the importance of catalogs as empirical benchmarks for addressing physical questions, in this case, questions regarding the nature of the nebulae. Like John's double star catalog, his work was a means of standardizing observations of nebulae and fixing them in terms of both their celestial location and physical description so that the data was available and of use to subsequent observers. After the death of John's mother in 1832, John felt at liberty to pursue a plan he'd been considering for years, traveling to the far reach of the British Empire in order to extend his father's sweeps for nebulae to the entire heavens. By this time, John had married Margaret Brodie Stewart, the daughter of a Scottish minister, and had started a family. He would sail for South Africa with his wife and 3 small children, and 3 more would be born during their time at the Cape. By the time of their departure, John was well known for his astronomy, but at this point he was also known as a popular writer, having published an important treatise on light, many said the most important since Newton's optics, soon to publish a treatise on astronomy, and a bestseller that is arguably the first work on the philosophy of science, a preliminary discourse on the study of natural philosophy. It was from this text that an entire generation of scientists, and we have to call them the first generation as the term was only coined in the mid-1800s, from this text that they learned to do science. This is the work of which Darwin, for instance, said, "Scarcely any other book has made such an impression on me." Darwin modeled his Origin of Species on the approach John outlined in the preliminary discourse. In contrast with his father, then, John was seen as an authority on science itself, not only astronomy. The results of John's observations at the Cape were the discovery of thousands of nebulae and star clusters, along with more double stars. A Google News alert for John Herschel returns almost daily science briefs or deep sky images with "discovered by John Herschel" in the image caption. In this, he was certainly his father's successor. His catalog of Southern Hemisphere nebulae, which made him the first person in history to closely survey the entire sky optically by telescope, was published as part of his immense Cape results and included not only his catalog of nebulae, but also chapters on stellar magnitudes, Halley's Comet, and observations of the system of Saturn's moons. And it's with the system of Saturn's moons I'll offer my final point on the enduring influence the Herschels together had on solar system nomenclature. So it's well known that when William Herschel discovered the first planet in recorded history, what we today know as Uranus, he originally dubbed it more or less George, after King George III, his eventual patron. John followed international convention and referred to the planet as Uranus, despite the preferences of some of his English colleagues. Naming conventions became a renewed issue in 1848 with the discovery of Neptune, which the French discoverer Leverrier was convinced to name after himself. Leverrier wrote to John. By this time, William Herschel is dead, and John Herschel is the only other astronomer with a vested personal interest. So Leverrier writes, agreeing to refer to Uranus as Herschel if John supported calling Neptune Leverrier. And again, this is already on top of the controversy of whether the British or the French should be given priority in the discovery of Neptune. So this is where Saturn's moons come into the story. Now, up to this point, moons in the solar system were not named, but rather numbered. This led to some confusion regarding the moons of Saturn, which at the time John was studying at the Cape were several in number, including 2 William had discovered. Nearly a decade after making his Cape observations, at the time the Neptune controversy is in full swing, John is still patiently working to reduce the data from the Cape, slowly preparing the Cape results for publication. Now, in John's work on Saturn's moons, despite a confused numbering system in which the number of the moon did not match up with the order from the planet, John continued to use numbers and not names for the moons in both his notes and his private correspondence. And this is actually an image from a letter from another observer, Lassell, as they're comparing moon locations. Continues to use numbering for moons, despite all the confusion it causes, until the very day he receives Leverrier's letter proposing names for the planets of Herschel and Leverrier. On that date, suddenly and for the first time, the mythological names of Titans appear for Saturn's moons. This convention was established with the publication of the Cape results and has endured since. Faced with the question of putting personal contemporary names in the heavens, John responds by doubling down on mythology. Now, in one sense, William had the last laugh, although, again, he may not have cared too much with his views on poetry. When years later, John was approached to suggest names for the confirmed 4 moons of Uranus, planet George, John Herschel offers the names of 4 sprites or airy spirits, Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, and Oberon, all of which happen to come not from mythology, but rather from English literature. So the convention that evolved, in which all Uranian moons are named for characters from Shakespeare, enshrines English literature around the planet originally named for an English king, thanks to the 2 Herschels. After John's return from the Cape of Good Hope, his observing days were behind him. He continued his experimental work, contributing to the development of photography, and eventually served for a time, like Newton had before him, as master of the mint. Near the end of his life, though, as larger telescopes are being constructed, he embarks on a project of collecting all observations, his father's, his own, and those of other observers, first into a general catalog of double stars. Or rather, he's working on the general catalog of double stars at the time of his death, first into a general catalog of nebulae. Again, what his father had begun, John worked to standardize and systematize, ensuring there was a baseline for studying the nebulae and establishing their locations and descriptions. This general catalog was, of course, the basis of the new general catalog compiled in 1888, 17 years after John's death. So whenever you see an NGC number, you're looking at the combined legacy of William, Caroline, and especially John Herschel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was, again, a great contribution to this interdisciplinary panel here. We do have a few questions before, or a few minutes for questions before the official end of the slot. So if you have one, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And then as we discussed before, we have a hard stop at 16:30 Eastern, but we're going to stay on and address some of these questions that we missed earlier. So are there any questions for Stephen? Perhaps the right thing to do is to go ahead and give the final thanks and wrap up, and then open questions for everyone. Panelists, feel free to turn on your cameras. I'll turn mine on too. And just to say thank you to all the panelists and everyone who presented their research, and also to all the attendees. We're all very encouraged by the amount of interest in the Herschels, and I feel like this will really facilitate further interdisciplinary work in this Herschel year. There have been several questions about the recording, and my information is that you'll be notified within the week about the recording, so you can stay tuned for that. You will now see an information sheet, or toward the end see an information sheet about Herschel events coming up, and there are a good number of them. There's a Yorkshire event that Woody and I will be taking part in June. A number of other things are starting to be planned. And I also want to point out that in the chat, there's a plug from the AAS committee about filling out a survey about light pollution, for just to draw your attention to that. Yeah, so like I said, we'll stay on for further questions now.
Could I just comment, Sarah? That
yeah, take over.
Further sources of information is designed for those that want to follow up. You might want to just take a screen capture. And the Herschel Society in Bath is going to be kind of the central repository of events in this year 1822. And so that's the place to monitor, mostly happening in England. But there are a couple others. This has been the first major one. And one other thing I wanted to ask Steve, of course, the French didn't want to call it George III by any means, Uranus, and so they called it Herschel pretty regularly for decades and decades. I don't think you emphasized that, did you?
I did not, but you are correct. Yes. So there was some precedent to Leverrier saying, "Hey, let's name my planet after me." What I thought was interesting was how Herschel himself, John Herschel rather, really resisted that, and even in his own private correspondence, he rarely referred to the planet as Herschel.
Right. Well, John Herschel, unlike his father, had read the classics and very much wanted to have a scheme that made sense relative to the present names of the other planets.
Another question for Steve. There was a little something in the chat about the date of Neptune's discovery. So the date of 1848 that you gave us, was that the date of the discussion or the correspondence you had?
Yeah, either I made a typo, which is quite possible, but I believe that is the controversy, the debate went on that long, and I'm guessing that 1848 is the year of the letter that passed between Herschel and Leverrier.
Okay, thank you. From the Q&A, there is a question for John Mulligan. It says, can you briefly trace any connection between the vertical sweep method of the Herschels and the rise of transit telescopes?
I can't draw a direct line between those two, but there's a good article called Astronomers Mark Time from 1988 that I looked up earlier to shoot. Let me grab that link. There we go. Yeah, I saw that question. I'm just gonna post the link as the response. Is that okay?
Good with me.
That I think rhymes very nicely with the kind of discipline that I was talking about in the paper, and that was emphasized very nicely by Steve. Feel free to follow up if that's not a good enough answer.
And yeah, I'm kind of jumping around the Q&A questions, but Woody, there is a question about the private archive of the correspondence with Jacob, who owns it and how you got it and what the plans are for it. A lot of people have had a question about plans for it, which I could say we're still thinking about it. But do you want to talk about the archive?
Well, in a nutshell, the Herschel family had several other astronomers, and John's son, one in particular, was a full-time astronomer. The two others did astronomy. 2 or 3 of his daughters cataloged all the books that John had and made other contributions to keeping the Herschel legacy alive. And eventually they gave most of their stuff to the RAS, but they kept a lot of stuff. And they kept all these letters. In the late 1950s, there was a big auction at Sotheby's. And that's when things scattered to wild places like Austin, Texas, and Berkeley, California, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And you should have heard Michael Hoskin talk about this, because for the equivalent today of a couple $100, you could get, a 50-page Herschel document in that auction. Just amazing. And the music and so forth. So the letters, however, stayed in the family. They never sold those. And but John Herschel, who was the great grandson, John Herschel Shorland, 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 he was very cooperative to people like me. He died about 5 years ago now, who came, let them photograph anything they found. And he had rooms full of Herschel memorabilia, not just William, but all the way through the family. And they're still there, but unfortunately, his son doesn't have as much room. And so they're not as easy to get a hold of. I think they should eventually go into a proper archive. I thought that when John Herschel Shorland died that they would, but they haven't. And so that's kind of the situation. But once again, if you really want to get your hands on them, if you're really serious and want to go to England and contact the son of John Herschel Shorland, who died recently, then they'll be happy to help you out. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, and about the transcription, there is someone who was working on this, hoping to make a book out of it, and I don't know if that project is continuing. So I didn't want to preempt that, or we didn't want to preempt that, but we also do recognize a lot of people are interested. So I am thinking about finding a way to post what we have and even making it like interactive, like a wiki, so that people can improve the translations rather than waiting for, and this is an idea that just popped in my head. I'm sure when Woody has like big exclamation points coming out of his head now. But if there is interest, and I'm sure that there is, it does seem that making this available sooner rather than later would be a good idea.
Yeah. It's a huge job to make a proper edition of it all, but your idea of a wiki is kind of interesting. I mean, no one, I was incredibly skeptical of Wikipedia, but in some sense, it works amazingly well.
Yes.
There's problems too, of course.
Yes, again, feel free to add to the Q&A, but let me hit a couple others. Bruce McIntyre says that when composer Joseph Haydn saw Herschel's 40-foot telescope in June 1792, Haydn expressed amazement that the astronomer would often spend 5 to 6 hours outside in the coldest weather, and was asking, does that amount of time correspond with the amounts of data entered in their notebooks? Anybody feel like answering, or anyone have an answer to that?
Well, yes. In their prime, when they were observing, they would get up every hour or two to check the sky. And if there was clouds had gone, they would observe for a couple hours. Any clear night, and of course, England's not the ideal place to be doing this kind of thing. They would be observing, and sometimes it could be for 6, 8 hours, 10 hours, even in the winter. More usual sessions were more like 2 to 4 hours. It varied, but oh yeah, I mean, it's incredible the amount of time that they put in observing.
Yes, and one thing Woody and I have discussed is that is one reason he wasn't really maintaining connections with music, except on cloudy days.
Yeah, right.
When after he left Bath, is that you can't go to a concert and also observe. Another question is, was Carolyn chiefly responsible for systematizing William's observing program?
I'm gonna stick to my party line on this one. And maybe, so feel free to object, please. We have plenty of time to talk it out, but I think that what's fascinating about their innovations in their organization of the observatory is that it makes it really is modern science insofar as it cannot be done by one person. And because of that, I think that any after the fact attempt to have some equitable distribution of credit is gonna run itself aground at some point or other. You're always gonna be able to say, oh, but they couldn't have done that without, right? And so at that point, it becomes a question. At that point, I think the frame has to change a little bit. So you could say, for instance, you could take the line and say that she's, as the bookkeeper, the person without whom the sweeps couldn't have been systematized. But then you could say, well, who taught? You could then you could do a bad faith move and say, but who taught her how to do that? Right? And so it constantly goes back and forth, which is why I favor which is why I like that corporate view that I'm pitching here, because I think it gets you around that issue. Yeah, so like the issue with modern science in this industrialized setting is that you get surplus data. Like the practices become so efficient at producing more knowledge than any person could credibly take credit for. I think should prompt us to do away with a notion of making geniuses and instead analyzing the mode of knowledge production and see what we can learn from that today.
Well, that's a very good answer. And, I would say also in music, sometimes when we are focusing particularly on women and underrepresented figures, we're often trying to drum up their accomplishments and then explain why those accomplishments were sort of thwarted by the situation at the time. And in doing that, you actually, it ends up being more minimizing of those accomplishments than it would be just to see how do these people work in the society that they're in. And that's all very complicated and everything. And but we can see this, we're still big on giving big prizes to, to individual names and, but we all know that that's not how the work is done, and that it doesn't accrue to a few names.
think you guys are absolutely right. And I was laughing at David's comment in the chat. He's like, so what would you call the relationship in a gallery label, right? Can you boil it down to collaboration? I would say the only thing that I would add, or maybe another layer of complexity, is how Caroline's work continues after William dies, right? When she's not with him at the telescope anymore, and she's continuing this process of curating, organizing, processing, and revisiting his data. So I think that just sort of maybe adds another layer of complexity to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I got a little too polemic in my dissertation and ended up being a bit cheeky and saying that John Herschel is actually his aunt's child more than her father's. And it's fine.
So one way I often say it is I think Carolyn increased William's productivity by at least a factor of 3 and maybe 5, and we don't know, but it was an incredible factor just in productivity, and that's very important. But even in the early days when Carolyn wasn't doing the recording, William is pretty systematic in his stuff. He keeps a good logbook, and in making telescopes, he's got 4 volumes that never got published of detailed experiments and so forth. So they both were very systematic in their organization, but he was happy to give it all to Carolyn, and then he could work on the Phil Trans papers and such.
What I find most intriguing about about their setup is that because they're innovating this whole workflow, they can't tell when they're setting it up which tasks are going to be creative and which are going to be drudgery.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's this scrum, right, where like you see them trying to and I think mostly William, but you see them trying to sort like who's gonna do the boring stuff and who's gonna do the creative stuff, right? But as came up with that conversation about her awarding of the gold medal, like even that late on, like there's still like it's still unresolved and work still has to be done in order to establish a gendered hierarchy in the roles.
I'd like to point out that there are several answered questions on the Q&A. We have a hard stop in about 5 minutes where everything will go dark. But you can look at the answered questions on the Q&A and see a couple of things. Someone was just asking me about the Halifax organ anecdote, which is true, although the details are a little bit different. Bruce McIntyre is asking how much of an oratorio on Paradise Lost do we have, and it's not much. I haven't looked at it extensively, but it's very much like an aria and not much else.
It's but like 10 pages or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but I hope that as we're working on the book, that I'm taking these questions seriously and making sure that we have answers for them as we work on it. Okay, any other last thoughts? And there's a question, is there any scordatura, David, in the viola concertos?
There is none in the viola concertos.
There we go.
And there's also none in the violin caprices as well.
And again, we have only a few minutes, but there's a question: do we know much about the family dynamics as John is growing up? Does Carolyn have? Women are often directly educated or involved in children's education. How much does Carolyn have an influence in John's education?
Just very briefly say she seems to have quite a bit not in the sense of like she's formally training him how to do things or teaching him specific methods, but she's very much around, helping raise him when he's young. And there are anecdotes about, doing chemistry experiments and stuff together, but not in any sort of formal role that I've seen. Yeah.
Can I just say thank you, Patrick, behind the scenes for keeping us honest here. But also, if we can just talk with each other for 2 minutes after we turn off the rest of the world, Patrick, please.
Yeah, the webinar will end promptly at 4:30 Eastern time.
And And so we need to,
So,
we
Well,
need to,
then maybe
I'm not
they,
sure if that's going to leave us on together or not.
okay, let's end it at 28 minutes after, so we have 2 minutes to just.
yeah. Well, it seems like it's an appropriate time to wrap up now. But thank you again to everyone who's participated. I saw people signing on from, every time zone and country in Argentina and, all over Europe as well as the Americas. So yeah, thank you so much for everyone who joined today.
And it was over 100 people for the entire thing, so that was great. We really appreciate it.
If we want to jump, oh, I thought I was muted. If we want to jump to a new call, I can drop a link in the chat so we don't get cut off in like 120 seconds.
Fine.
I'll send that.
So Patrick, I mainly wanted to ask you, can we get a complete record of the chat? Because I haven't been able to read it.
I do think it's in the recording.
I saved it on my computer as well. I can send it to you guys.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Because of that question, yeah.
That was very well thought of.
Good job, everyone. This was lovely. Really enjoyed it.
So I got a lot out of it.
I'm very pleased. These are really fantastic talks and so many different angles on mostly the non-astronomy of William Herschel, but it was good to have the some astronomy in there too.
For sure.
Yeah, when are we going to be able to buy a CD? Because that music is incredible.
Who buys CDs? Yeah, I know, me too.
I'll take vinyl.
Well, I mean, I would love to make a higher quality recording of this, time permitting, and then just, make it available through Spotify or whatever.
That'd be great.
The various things on YouTube, I don't know if you've looked around, John, vary greatly in their audio quality as well as the player's quality, but there are some very nice ones though.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm talking about like specifically like
this
performance and what Sarah was playing, because those were incredible.
Yeah.
I believe the participants have been logged off.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sarah's recordings are already available, right?
Yeah, I made a list of
On Spotify.
available recordings in the chat.
Oh, I see. You did. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, in between everything else. All right.
The
Well,
recording that is automatic won't be available for a few hours. It takes a while to process it.
oh, sure.
Well, you can take the rest of your Saturday off. You don't have to do it right now. Yeah, so great, gang. This really was a hell of a lot of fun and a lot of interesting academic questions have arisen from it, and a lot of cross pollination here, which I'm delighted to see.
Great. Thanks for letting me participate.
I really enjoyed your paper, Cliff.
Thank you.
Yeah, same. I'm grateful. I really appreciate being able to have joined you all.
So, Cliff, is yours going to be coming out in the Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage?
No, I've already written two major things on Herschel and poetry. One is in the book from 2018 that I edited. And then in the JAHH, I wrote a paper with another 45 poems on Herschel. So I've already written a lot on about 90 different poems of Herschel. So I think I'm not writing any more.
But I don't think that you've done the whole Bernie thing, emphasizing that, have you?
Well, that was all in my books and my PhD thesis.
Oh, okay. Well, I will get that out. I know the musicologists would love to read about it.
Yeah, because I did a 5-volume series for Springer on the first 4 asteroids. So everything about Bernie is in there in very great detail.
Okay, I'd forgotten that you did Bernie in there. This is now like, what, 10 years ago?
No, more recent than that. But it's maybe 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
Guys, I've got to run. Thank you so much. And
Thanks, Steve.
yeah, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Don't forget to celebrate John Herschel's birthday on Monday.
Oh, yeah, I'm
Will
glad you
do.
brought that up.
Absolutely.
See you guys.
Bye for now.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
So you got another 10 years, you can have a 250th anniversary of Herschel's birth.
I'll be there.
I'll be there.
I admit I got screwed up by the central time thing. I thought we had another hour.
Yeah. And Woody, if you don't need me, I'm going to go, and I'm very sorry about my audio mix-up, which I solved, but I can tell you about it later.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. No, I think we should go. I just want to make sure I got that question in about the chats, because I want to read those and think about them and answer people. Oh, and I'm going to send everybody, I've got a alphabetical list of all registrants and their emails. And so you'll be interested to see that 240 or something that registered.
Hey, Sarah, what was the fix?
We basically got 50% that actually.
Sorry, what'd you say?
I was just wondering what the audio fix was in case it comes up.
I
again.
Unplugged my headphones and replugged them in.
Okay.
I was getting a feedback loop where I could hear myself like on an infinite recursive loop, and if I had checked my playback beforehand, it would have been better. And I'm sorry that I didn't do that. But anyway,
We got a little music, and the talk was excellent. So
okay, well, thank you. And yes, it's there for people who want to do the work to find the recording. So.
but we also, I don't know if you saw this in the chat, we had someone volunteer.
Yeah, I mean, one could do that. That would be fine. If people.
It actually helped us out time-wise, I think.
It did a bit. Yeah. And actually, David made the same points quite a bit better with his, so it was fine. In the end, it just was a little awkward at the moment.
Now, would people be
David,
interested
how did you do that?
How did I do what?
You're playing two different instruments at the same time. I mean,
Phil Mora, I had to learn it. It was the hardest part.
that was amazing.
Screen sharing.
I know you did it all in one take.
Yeah, you can tell. Had I done a lot more takes, it would have been improved. But yeah, you had to coordinate so that they can play back at the same time, and there was all this. It was a fun
That's
thing.
impressive, I got to say. Yeah.
Phil Mora, what all the kids are using now.
Would people be interested in everybody sharing their slide pack?
Sure.
I would be interested in seeing the other slides for sure, especially, Sarah's slides were awesome and dense and complex and full of all good stuff.
Full of animations, yeah.
And certainly my neurons didn't capture them in one
Right.
hit.
Yeah. Well, David, maybe you and I would actually benefit from a further talk sometime. So
I would love that.
we can set that up. But yeah, maybe we can make a Dropbox or something that we can share our slides to.
Let's do that. I'd very much like to, and if people have some text they're willing to share that they were using, then that would be great too. But the slides would be the first thing I think of. We're on the AAS. We're over 5 minutes now. So thank you, Patrick, for.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's a very informative Saturday. I should get some college credit for this.
Oh, right. Extension credit, right.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Y'all have a great day.
Have a good Saturday.
All righty, bye-bye.